It had been raining sand non-stop for 3 days, and the sky above Route 99 was the color of rusty iron. Arden walked along the deserted road, counting his steps to keep his mind off his thirst. On his back hung a backpack containing his last canteen and a tin box holding his inheritance, the key to Grandpa Ivo's gas station, and a crumpled map with a cross marked at the intersection of 2 old highways. Grandpa had died a month ago, and the caravan travelers had passed the box from hand to hand until it found his grandson. Everyone who handed the box over said the same thing. The young man had inherited a grave with gas pumps. The gas station had stood in the middle of the wasteland for 40 years, and for the last 8 of those, it hadn't seen a single drop of fuel. Arden saw it at sunset. 2 rusty pumps, a collapsed awning, a store with smashed windows, and underground tanks holding 4,000 liters each, as empty as the promises of the old world. He unlocked the door with a key, and at that moment, the ground trembled beneath his feet. A voice, like the grinding of a relay, rang out in his head. Node error detected. Power station system activated. Node status dormant. Tank 10 liters. Tank 20 liters. Inflow condition. Living people and operating machines within the station's circuit. Current inflow 0. Arden stood in the middle of the dusty store and stared at the numbers hanging right in the air before his eyes. He touched them with his hand, and his fingers passed right through them. The system explained dryly. Every living person within the circuit contributes 3 liters of fuel per night. Every operating machine contributes 11 liters per night. The circuit's radius is 100 steps from the core. The core is located beneath the cash register. Arden sat down on the floor and began to laugh. Then he stopped. In a world where caravans slaughter each other over a canister, this was no inheritance. It was both a bomb and a throne. In the morning, Harlan the trader's truck pulled up to the station. Harlan had been buying up scrap metal all along the highway and had known Grandpa Ivo for 30 years. He climbed out of the cab, looked at Arden, and shook his head. He said that a city boy wouldn't last even a week here. He said he'd buy the station for 2 crates of canned goods and drive the kid to the camp by the salt lake. He spoke slowly, as if to a sick person. At that moment, his truck's engine was idling, and Arden was listening not to Harlan, but to the engine. He raised his hand and asked for silence. Harlan fell silent at such audacity. Arden said the 3rd cylinder was misfiring. He said the fuel injector was clogged, and that in 200 kilometers, the truck would come to a standstill in the middle of the wasteland, forever. He walked over to the hood, removed the cover, located the right fuel line by ear, relieved the pressure, pulled out the injector, and cleaned it with a needle from his grandfather's repair kit. The whole thing took 20 minutes. The engine started running as smoothly as an old-fashioned sewing machine. Harlan stood there, his expression slowly changing. First, mockery, then disbelief, then something resembling fear. He asked how the kid knew all this. Arden replied that his grandfather had been writing him letters from the caravans for 8 years. Each letter contained a diagram: pumps, diesel engines, turbines, compressors. His grandfather had been preparing him for this station his whole life. It's just that no one had noticed. Harlan silently climbed into the cab. He left the canned goods on the porch and didn't charge him for them. Before driving off, he said he'd been wrong about the week. He said he was now giving the kid a month. Arden didn't sleep that night. He sat at the cash register and stared at the numbers. 1 living person in the system. Inflow 3 liters. In the morning, exactly 3 liters of real 92-octane fuel sloshed around in the tank. He let a drop fall onto his palm, sniffed it, and rubbed it between his fingers. The smell hit him like a memory of the old world. Fuel from the air, from his own breath and body heat. He realized the rule that would change everything. Stations don't need tankers or towers. Stations need people. The more life there is around the core, the fuller the tanks. The whole world is fighting over gas, and his weapon is hospitality. On the fourth day, a dusty trail appeared on the horizon. A buggy with a punctured radiator was hobbling toward the station. At the wheel sat Pike, a garbage collector as skinny as a rake. Beside him was his sister, Una, with a crossbow resting on her lap. They stopped 50 paces away, and Pike shouted that all they needed was water and shade until sunset. Una kept Arden in her sights the entire time they spoke. Arden brought them a canteen and told them they could stay the night for free. Pike laughed and replied that the only thing that's free in the wasteland is death. Arden shrugged and added that he'd take a look at their radiator while he was at it. Una told her brother it was a trap. She said that a loner at a deserted gas station was either a madman or bait set by a gang. Arden opened up the radiator, found a crack, cleaned it out, and patched it up with an old generator part from his grandfather's machine. He'd fixed the generator back on the second day by taking 3 broken ones and putting together one that worked. Una watched his every move, her finger on the trigger. When the buggy's engine started on half a turn, she lowered her crossbow. That night, the system displayed new numbers. 3 people in the circuit, 1 working vehicle. Inflow, 20 liters. Arden watched as the tank gauge slowly crept upward and heard 2 strangers sleeping behind the wall. People who were keeping his station alive simply by breathing. In the morning, he poured 5 liters into Pike's tank. Pike stared at the stream of fuel and couldn't close his mouth. He asked where the gas came from at a station that had gone out of business 8 years ago. Arden replied that his grandfather had left a stash. It was the first lie of the settlement, and he decided it wouldn't last long. Pike proposed a deal. He said he knew all the scrap yards within a 3 days' journey and could haul scrap metal and spare parts. Una added that she could shoot and see in the dark better than a cat. They asked only for food, water, and a spot by the wall. Arden agreed, and the moment they shook hands, the system came to life. Condition met. First, permanent residence. Reward, perimeter blueprint. Construction of a scrap metal wall is now available. Requires 800 kilograms of steel and 3 workers. A diagram unfolded before Arden's eyes. A ring of walls encircling the perimeter. A gate. A watchtower. He looked at the blueprint and, for the first time in a month since his grandfather's death, felt not emptiness, but a sense of purpose. That evening, Pike shared the latest news from the highway. He spoke quietly and kept glancing out at the darkness beyond the windows. He said that to the north, Garm's gang was running rampant, burning down camps for 20 liters of diesel. He said that Baron Crow controlled all the roads to the east. He possessed the last functioning tanker from the old world and his own army of freight. He said that caravans pay the Baron for every sip of fuel with weapons, food, and people. Arden listened and watched the meter in the corner of his eye. 23 liters over 2 nights. A drop in a world of thirst, but a drop that grows with every new breath taken nearby. He asked Pike how many people were in an average caravan. Pike replied that there were between 20 and 40 people and between 5 and 10 vehicles. Arden closed his eyes and did the math. 40 people meant 120 liters per night. 10 vehicles is another 110 liters. 1 caravan stopping for the night equals a quarter of the tank. He opened his eyes and said they didn't need to build a fortress. He said they would build a crossroads, a place where caravans would want to come of their own accord. Water, shade, repairs, and a safe night's sleep. Una asked what he would do when wolves like Garm found out about the station. Arden was silent for a long time. Then he replied that wolves drive cars too, and all cars break down sooner or later. That night, he went out to the fuel pumps and and looked north. There, beyond the black horizon, a distant storm was churning, and dry lightning flashed deep within it. The system beeped softly. "Attention! An anomalous sandstorm has been detected within the long-range scan radius. Class unknown. The storm's core is shielded." Arden asked what shielded meant. The system replied that it couldn't see inside. It said this was the first object in its entire history that it couldn't read. Arden stood in the wind, the sand stinging his cheek. The abandoned gas station behind him breathed steadily, and 23 liters of the future sloshed around in its iron belly. He didn't yet know that in 6 days, the entire highway would know about those liters. They began building the wall at dawn on the 6th day. Pike drove up a trailer full of rusty hoods and frames from a nearby junkyard. Una cut the metal with an angle grinder powered by a generator. Arden welded the seams and marked out the ring in 100-step intervals along the perimeter. The system kept track of the steel within its field of view. 200 kilograms, 400, 600. The work lasted 9 days and played out in Arden's memory in brief flashes. Here's Pike collapsing from the heat and Una pouring water on the back of his neck. Here's a weld cracking open at night from the temperature swing and Arden re-welding it by the light of the headlights. Here's the first section of the wall standing against the wind, and for the first time in 40 years, the sand crashes against the barrier without reaching the columns. Here is Una standing on an unfinished tower, looking at the highway through the scope. On the 9th day, the system declared the perimeter complete. The reward for the first structure was an expansion of the perimeter to 150 steps. Arden looked at the ring of rusty hoods and did not see a junkyard. He saw the border of a new world. The caravan arrived on the 11th day. 8 vehicles, 31 people. Leading the way was an old bus sheathed in sheets of boilerplate. The caravan was led by a woman named Syra, with a face scorched by the sun and eyes the color of faded steel. She stopped the column 300 paces away and stepped out alone, empty-handed, as was the custom on the trail. Arden stepped out to meet her, alone as well. Syra surveyed the new wall of the encampment and the canopy, and asked what this circus in the middle of the wasteland was all about. Arden replied that it was a station, 1 cup of water per person, free of charge. Repairs in exchange for scrap metal and food. A safe place to spend the night inside the wall for 10 kilograms of any cargo from the vehicle. Sarah laughed in his face. She said she'd been driving caravans for 20 years and had seen 100 such friendly places. She said they all ended the same way. At night, the guests were slaughtered for their vehicles and cargo. She said her people wouldn't go inside the wall, but they'd take the water and leave. Arden didn't argue. He just asked her to show him the lead vehicle of the caravan because he'd heard it pull up. Sarah narrowed her eyes but nodded. Arden walked over to the bus, listened to the engine idling, asked them to rev it up, and turned to Sarah. He said the transmission was on its last legs. He said the secondary shaft bearing was falling apart, and it had about 300 kilometers left. He said that in 300 kilometers, 31 people would be stranded in the middle of the dead land, unable to move. The mechanic of the caravan, a gray-haired man named Tob, crawled under the bus, fiddled around there for 10 minutes, then crawled out and looked silently at Sarah. That look said it all. Cyrus stared at Arden for a long time, then asked how much it would cost. Arden replied that he didn't have a bearing, but he could machine the housing and transfer the bearing from a scrapped vehicle at Pike's junkyard. A day's work. The price? A night's lodging for the entire caravan inside the wall and a sack of grain. Syra said he was either a genius or the craftiest killer on the trail. She drove the caravan inside, but stationed her sentries opposite Arden's. The night passed quietly. The caravan's people slept with one eye open, clutching their weapons. Meanwhile, in the station's underground bowels, a miracle was unfolding that only Arden knew about. 34 people in the loop, 9 vehicles, an inflow of 201 liters in a single night. Arden sat at the cash register and watched as the tank's gauge crept upward with every minute of others' sleep. His station drank life as peacefully as a tree drinks light. In the morning, he finished the bus body. Tobbs inspected the work as meticulously as an examiner. He drove the bus in circles, listened to the radio, and finally cut the engine. He told Syra in front of everyone that the seam on the frame was smoother than the factory's. He said that in the old world, hands like that were paid for in gold. Syra paid him in grain, fair and square, and threw in a box of 12-gauge shotgun shells on top of that. Before they left, she took Arden aside. She said that secrets don't stay secrets for long on the highway. She said that last night, one of her men had seen the fuel gauge needle on the gas pump wobble and creep upward all on its own. Arden held her gaze and repeated the legend about his grandfather's stash in the far tank. Syra nodded the way people nod when they don't believe a single word. She said she'd be back in a month with goods from the south. She said that if the station was still standing by then, she'd bring 2 more caravans from her guild. The convoy headed east, and the system beeped. Condition met. First caravan at the overnight stop. Reward. Blueprint for a repair bay. Requirements. 1 metric ton of steel, 200 kilograms of tools, and an inspection pit. Node bonus. Repair speed in the bay is doubled. Arden showed the blueprint to Pike and Una. Pike whistled and said that any caravan mechanic would sell his soul for a repair bay like that. Una wasn't looking at the blueprint, she was looking north. She said that in the morning, from the watchtower, she'd seen a glint of glass on a distant dune. A single glint, a brief one. That's how optics glint. Arden felt a chill run down his spine. They were already being watched. The following days merged into a whirl of work. Here's Pike hauling steel and cursing at a stubborn trailer. Here's Una test-firing the donated rounds and setting up decoy silhouettes made of pipes and rags along the crest of the wall. Here's Arden digging an inspection pit until his hands were covered in bloody blisters and hoisting a winch from a dead crane above it. Here, the first stragglers are pulling up to the station, having heard from the people of Syra about water and honest repairs. The family of the tanner Ortis in a 3-wheeled truck. Finn, the mute guy, with a motorcycle without a muffler. Mara, the old herbalist, whose only possessions are a donkey and a box of dried herbs. Arden accepted anyone who agreed to 2 rules. Do not draw your weapon inside the wall. Work inside the wall. By the end of the 3rd week, 11 people were living within the perimeter, and 6 vehicles were parked there. The nighttime inflow had grown to 99 liters. The first reservoir was 1/3 full. The station was beginning to smell of life. The smoke from Mara's hearth, Ortis's skin, the hot metal of the boxing ring. In the evenings, all the residents gathered by the eastern wall, and Arden listened to the trail of their voices. That's how he learned that Garm's gang had burned down the camp by the dry riverbed, and that Baron Crow had doubled the price of fuel because his old tanker was on its last legs. Mara said quietly that thirst makes wolves bold. She said the wolves would soon come here too, because the scent of water and iron travels along the trail faster than the wind. Una shouted from the watchtower that there was a glare in the north again. Arden climbed up to her and looked through his grandfather's binoculars for a long time. On the crest of a distant dune lay a man with a scope, not even bothering to hide. He looked at the station the way one looks at a set table. Then he slid down from the crest, and a minute later, a plume of exhaust shot up from behind the dune. The motorcycle sped off to the north, toward where, according to Pike, Garm's encampment was located. Arden didn't sleep that night. He was doing the math. There were 1,400 liters in the tank. The wall could stop a bullet, but not a ram. There were 3.5 fighters at the station, if you counted the mute Finn with his shotgun. Rumor had it that Garm had 20 guns and 6 vehicles. The system had been silent all evening, and then it spat out a line that made Arden's jaw drop. The node's forecast: an 87% probability of an attack within 4 days. Recommendation: increase the inflow. On the morning of the fourth day after the glare, Una fired a shot from a gas cylinder. Dust was rising from the north. 6 vehicles spread out in a fan formation. Arden climbed up to the tower, and his binoculars revealed what he'd feared he'd see. Leading the way was a makeshift armored vehicle, a school bus with a bulldozer blade welded onto the front. Behind it were 2 pickup trucks with machine guns mounted on turrets. 3 buggies flanked them. A snarling dog's muzzle was painted in white on the armored vehicle's blade. The GARM symbol. The system coldly calculated the distance. 3 kilometers. 2.5. Arden gave the orders according to the plan they'd run through for 3 evenings. Ortiz and his family, along with Mara, were to go to the store's basement. Finn, with a shotgun, was to take up a position at the gate. Pike was to head for the generator. Una was to go up to the watchtower. He himself stood at the gate with his grandfather's rocket launcher. 1,940 liters sloshed in the tank, 60 liters short of the defense plan. One night, he didn't have. GARM's column came to a halt 400 paces away. A man who looked like a withered bull climbed out of the armored vehicle's hatch. GARM spoke through a tin megaphone, and his voice screeched across the wasteland. He said he'd heard a tale about a station with water and gasoline. He said that tales belonged to the strong. He gave the residents an hour to come out beyond the wall, leaving everything inside. He swore he wouldn't harm those who came out, because the dead don't tell other fools how generous GARM is. Arden listened, but he wasn't looking at GARM. He was looking at his vehicles. 6 engines were idling 400 paces from the wall. And a thought exploded in Arden's head, making his mouth go dry. The station's perimeter after the reward was 150 paces, but the system counted the vehicles within the perimeter, not his friend's vehicles within the perimeter. He asked the system in a whisper. The system replied instantly. The ownership of the vehicles doesn't matter. What matters is whether an engine is running within the perimeter. Arden felt the fear inside him slowly turn inside out and become calculation. He didn't need enemies driven off. He needed enemies standing close by for a long time. He shouted to GARM that the residents agreed to surrender but needed an hour to pack up. GARM bellowed into the megaphone and replied that he'd give them half an hour. The column crept closer and formed a semicircle 100 paces from the gate, right inside the perimeter. 6 running engines, 22 people. The system hummed quietly in the corner of his vision. The real-time influx had been recalculated. Arden stared at the numbers and stalled for time as best he could. He argued that the old woman couldn't walk fast. He asked for permission to fetch water. He asked if they could leave the donkey behind. GARM neighed, bored, and basked in the sun, but he didn't turn off the engines because the gang always keeps their vehicles running. 20 minutes passed. 30. The tank gauge crept up to 1,990. There were 10 liters left until it reached 2,000 when GARM's patience ran out. He ordered the crew to tear down the gate. The armored vehicle roared and moved forward. And then Arden did what he'd rehearsed with Pike all last night for the worst-case scenario. He fired the rocket launcher, not at the armored vehicle, but straight up into the air. A red star hung over the station. It was a signal. In the pit, Pike yanked the lever, and a cable that had been buried there in advance snapped taut across the road in front of the gate at hub height. It was an old tow cable from a cruiser tractor. The armored vehicle caught it with its blade, dragged it 10 paces, and the cable acted like a sling, tearing the blade from its mountings and twisting the front axle. The vehicle buried its nose in the sand 30 paces from the gate. Its engine continued to roar. The system clanged so loudly that Arden flinched. The fuel tank reached 2,000 liters. The defensive perimeter blueprint is open. Fuel curtain activation is available. Consumption, 200 liters. A diagram unfolded before his eyes that Arden didn't have time to read. He simply shouted the command, "Activate," to the system. From the drainage pipes buried along the wall, which he'd spent a week dismissing as his grandfather's useless legacy, sprayed jets of fuel burst forth and ignited from piezoelectric igniters. A wall of fire 2 human tall, roaring, scorching, alive. The horse-like screech of the turreted machine guns choked off. Bullets flew blindly through the fire and vanished into the haze. The buggies jerked backward. One pickup truck turned too sharply and tipped onto its side. Garm bellowed into the megaphone, but for the first time in years, the gang saw the wasteland ablaze, and fear proved stronger than their thirst. Una, from the watchtower, fired single shots through gaps in the curtain of fire and took out 2 turret gunners. Finn, at the gate, met head-on the 3 boldest men who had climbed through the smoke. Arden stood in the gate with a crowbar and met the 4th man. The fight at the gate was short, messy, and terrifying. Arden took a sweeping machete blow to the shoulder and didn't feel any pain until the very end. He knocked his opponent down with a blow to the knee and finished him off with the hilt. By the time the smoke began to clear, the gang was already loading the wounded into the vehicle. Garm abandoned both the armored vehicle and the flatbed pickup. The convoy of 4 vehicles headed north, firing back in bursts. Una watched them disappear over the horizon through her sights, but Arden forbade her from firing after them. Dead enemies are silent, but fleeing enemies tell their story. Let the highway hear that the station bites back with fire. The silence after the battle rang out. Mara was already cutting open Arden's sleeve and pouring burning tincture into the wound. Ortiz and his sons were putting out the fires along the wall. Pike climbed out of the pit, black with soot, and was shaking. Of the 22 raiders, 7 remained lying by the wall, dead. The gang had abandoned 3 wounded men, and Mara tended to them without a single question. Arden stood over the overturned armored vehicle, listening to its still-running engine and laughing through the pain in his shoulder. The system summarized the battle in lines he would remember for the rest of his life. Attack by superior forces repelled. The outpost is secured using inflow mechanics. Tactical assessment, excellent. Reward, blueprints for a 20-person living module. Reward, permanent upgrade to the smokescreen nozzle. Consumption reduced to 150 liters. Trophies have been credited to the system. The armored vehicle is to be repaired. The pickup truck is to be restored. The night after the battle, the station didn't sleep. People sat huddled shoulder to shoulder by the hearth fire and remained silent. Then Ortiz began to sing softly in his southern language, and Mara joined in. Arden listened and watched the counter. 14 people in the circuit, including the prisoners. 8 vehicles, including the captured ones that Pike had already started up. Fuel flow, 130 liters. The station ran just as smoothly through that terrible night as it did any other. In the morning, the prisoners asked to speak. The oldest among them, a wiry guy with a scar across his eyebrow, introduced himself as Ren. He said he joined the gang because of a debt and that he had nowhere to go back to because Garm doesn't forgive those who leave. He asked that they be allowed to stay on as workers under any conditions. Arden thought it over for a day and consulted with Una. Una said they couldn't be trusted, but they could be used. Arden left the 3 under her supervision to do menial labor without weapons, so the population grew to 14. And 2 days later, something happened that immediately made the entire victory seem insignificant. Harlan arrived at the station. The old trader had aged 10 years in a single month. He didn't haggle or talk about metal. Over the next 2 weeks, the station grew so quickly that Arden sometimes didn't recognize it in the mornings. The construction of the living module played out in his memory as 4 scenes. Here's Ren, with 2 former gangsters, hauling railroad ties for the foundation, while Una watches them from the watchtower, her finger never leaving the trigger. Here's Ortiz stretching leather panels over the roof frame and teaching the mute Finn how to tie a sailor's knot using the same gestures. travelers. Here was the first family of refugees carrying a rag bundle with a baby into the module, and Mira placing a bundle of wormwood above the door to ward off the evil eye. Here was the system shutting down the construction log and reporting that the first-level residential module had been accepted, and the perimeter expanded to 200 steps. People were coming now every day. Rumors of a station that had burned a gang to the ground and repaired machines spread along the highway faster than the wind. Lone travelers with empty eyes arrived. Families arrived with their last few liters of fuel. Dagvo the blacksmith arrived with a portable anvil and bellows. A silent female marksman named Kestra arrived, with 11 notches on her rifle stock. Arden adhered strictly to 2 rules and added a third. Do not draw your weapon inside the walls. Work inside the walls. Do not ask who a person was on the outside while inside the walls. By the middle of the month, 29 people were living within the perimeter, and 13 vehicles were parked there. The nightly inflow exceeded 230 liters. The first tank filled to the brim, and the system began pouring into the second. That was when Selma arrived. She drove up in a self-propelled workshop cobbled together from a bread delivery van. She'd spent half her life repairing the vehicles of Baron Crow's own convoys until she fled from him after losing her husband in his gang wars. Selma walked around the station with the air of an old-world inspector. She ran her fingers along the wall seams, peered into the repair pit, tapped the column with her knuckles, and delivered her verdict in front of everyone. She said the wall was homemade, the booth was makeshift, and the owner was just a boy who simply hadn't yet encountered true power. She said she'd seen the Baron dismantle camps like this in a single morning, without even turning off his engines. She'd stayed only because her van needed a new wheel hub assembly. Arden machined the assembly for her overnight in the workshop, where work speed was doubled. In the morning, Selma checked for play, spun the wheel, and remained silent for a long time. Then she asked to see the machine tool. Arden showed her the machine, the homemade cutters, and a hand-drawn sketch of the module overlaid on the system diagram. Selma stared at that sketch for so long that the line outside the workshop began to grumble. Then she said quietly that her husband used to draw exactly the same way, with those same silly double arrows. She said she would stay. From that day on, the repair queue moved twice as fast, and no one criticized the station more meticulously than Selma, and that was the best test of every weld. In the evenings, Arden convened a council by the hearth. Una was in charge of the walls and patrols. Pike was in charge of the dump and steel. Selma was in charge of the boxing ring. Dagvo was in charge of the forge. Mara was in charge of water and the sick. At these council meetings, the station named itself for the first time. Ortiz once said that in the wasteland, a crossroads is where roads kiss. So the station became Crossroads, and the name stuck in a single evening. And then the Baron's envoy arrived. He appeared at sunset in an off-road vehicle so spotless it was almost indecent, with a flag made from a white canister flying from the antenna. The envoy's name was Locke, and he was dressed in a pre-war suit and tie, which, in the middle of the wasteland, looked more terrifying than any armor. Locke spoke politely, and that politeness carried the chill of a water tank. He said that Baron Crow congratulated the young master on his successes. He said that the Baron was a man of order, and was offering Crossroads a place in his trade network. The terms were simple: half of all fuel, monthly, the Baron's garrison inside the walls for protection, and a personal visit by the station's owner to the Citadel to sign the papers. Locke smiled and waited. All of Crossroads stood around him, waiting as well. Arden could feel the fear in his men's backs. Everyone knew what a Baron's garrison inside the walls meant. It was a noose. Arden replied calmly and loudly so that everyone could hear. He said that Crossroads trades with everyone and is at war with no one. He said that fuel is not a tribute paid to anyone. because the fuel here belongs to those whose breath and labor create it. He said that the Baron and his men are welcome to come as guests. Water by the cup, repairs according to the price list, lodging at the standard rate, just like everyone else. Locke stopped smiling. He said quietly that the Baron's offer was a one-time thing. He got into a clean SUV, and the dust he kicked up lingered in the sunset air for a long time. That night at the council meeting, Eunice stated bluntly that it was now war. Selma nodded and shared what she knew from the inside. The Baron's convoy consisted of 15 security vehicles, a fuel tanker, a command all-terrain vehicle, and between 40 and 60 firearms. The Baron raided the camps following the same pattern, a day-long blockade to lure them out, then a ram attack on the gates with an empty fuel tanker under armored cover, then a sweep. Arden listened and wrote down every word with a charcoal stick on a piece of plywood. Then he asked the system what the next supply line would yield. The system replied that with a total reserve of 5,000 liters, the blueprint for the Corps' power shield would unlock, and with 40 residents, the blueprint for a deep horizon water well would unlock. Water was the deciding factor. Having its own water supply made Crossroads independent even under siege. Arden announced 2 goals at the council meeting: 40 residents and 5,000 liters by the end of the month. The following days were spent preparing for the project. Here, Dagvo is forging the tips for the anti-ram hedgehogs out of springs. Here are Pike and Wren digging the spikes into the ground in a checkerboard pattern in front of the gates. And Wren is working so fiercely it's as if he's driving his past into the sand. Here is Kestra putting 8 new recruits with rifles through their paces along the wall and making them hold their breath. Here is Selma going over Garm's captured armored vehicle and painting a new name on its side. A new name in paint: Hammer. Here's Una leading 2 scouts into the darkness at night and returning with a map of the Baron's outposts on the Eastern Road. By the end of the month, 42 people were living at the Crossroads. The system drilled a well, and for 3 days the entire station listened to the drill gnawing through the sandstone. At a depth of 70 meters, the drill hit water, and when the first jet shot out of the pipe, people held their heads under it and laughed like children. Mara wept openly. The old woman said she hadn't seen water come to people in 40 years. Instead, people had always died for water. By that time, the inflow had stabilized at 300 liters per night. The total reserve had reached 5,000, and the system produced a blueprint for the power shield. Arden read the description and couldn't believe it. A refraction dome above the station's core, dissipating kinetic energy at the inlet. The power consumption was monstrous: 1,000 liters per hour of operation. A weapon of last resort. And that very night, 2 pieces of news arrived at once. The first was brought by a boy from Sarah's caravan on a motorcycle revved up until it belched gray smoke. Sarah had kept her word and was leading 3 caravans from her guild toward the Crossroads. 60 people and 20 vehicles. But on the Eastern Road, they were stopped by the Baron's checkpoint. Crow had blocked the route and announced to everyone that trading with the Crossroads was prohibited, under penalty of vehicle confiscation. The caravans had been stuck there for days, waiting for Sarah's decision. The second piece of news came from the system. The message was brief, and it made the hairs on Arden's arms stand on end. The anomalous storm had altered its behavior. In the morning, Arden convened a council and placed a plywood board with 2 arrows on the table. The eastern arrow represented the Baron, the northern arrow the storm. He said that waiting behind the wall meant letting Crow choose the timing and strangle the Crossroads without a single shot fired. The blockade was killing them more slowly than a battering ram, but more surely. The caravans were the lifeblood of the station. No guests, no inflow, no fuel, no shield. He said he'd go to the eastern outpost himself. The council erupted. Una said it was suicide. Selma said the Baron collects such daredevils in a pit beneath the citadel. Pike simply stood up and said he was going too. Arden let them vent and explained the plan. They wouldn't be breaking through. They would bring the eastern outpost something the Baron's men hadn't seen in years. A choice. A day later, a strange convoy rolled out toward the eastern outpost. Leading the way was the Hammer, with its gun ports welded shut. Behind it was Selma's van. Bringing up the rear was a captured pickup truck, with Kestra manning the turret. The Baron's outpost was well designed. A rail car buried in a sand dune, 2 machine gun emplacements, a barrier made from a railroad track, and 10 fighters. The outpost was commanded by a veteran named Targ, whose face was covered in scars. Half a kilometer from the outpost, Arden's convoy came to a stop, and he walked forward alone, holding a white canister aloft. Targ came out to meet him, with a sniper providing cover. He said he had orders to turn back anyone heading for the crossroads, and that, personally, he didn't give a damn what the kid was selling there. Arden replied that he hadn't come to argue with the orders. He set the canister down on the sand and opened the lid. The scent of pure 92-octane fuel wafted through the air. Arden said it was a gift for the outpost, 20 liters. And then he said the most important part. He knew that the Baron's people were being rationed fuel at a rate of 100 grams per vehicle per day, and that half their rations had been cut twice in a month because the Citadel's old fuel tank was 2/3 empty. He proposed a simple solution. The outpost was located on the highway and beyond. The order wouldn't technically be violated if the caravans took the old riverbed 3 kilometers south of the highway instead of the main road. The outpost wouldn't see a thing. And once a week, Crossroads would leave a barrel of fuel and a barrel of water at the mouth of the riverbed. For the outpost, personally. Targ was silent for a long time. Then he asked how Arden knew about the reduced rations. Arden replied that the mechanics who repair the convoy vehicles hear more than the commanders do. Selma waved to Targ from the van, and the veteran recognized her and cursed at length, almost respectfully. He said the Baron would hang people for that. Arden nodded and replied that the Baron was far away, but thirst was close at hand. And he added one last thing. When the Citadel's tanker runs dry, the Baron will have to go to the crossroads, either to pay homage or to storm it. If it's a storming, Targ's men will be put in the first wave, just as outposts are always deployed. And they'll die for the Baron's right to own what the crossroads already sells to anyone willing to pay a fair price. Targ stared at the canister. The wind whipped sand across the railroad tracks at the barrier. Then the veteran said that at night his post slept soundly and the old riverbed couldn't be seen from the watchtower. He took the canister and left without saying goodbye. 2 days later, 3 of Sarah's caravans entered the crossroads via the old riverbed without a single shot being fired. 64 people, 21 vehicles. The station was buzzing like a beehive. The refueling bay was operating in 3 shifts. Dugwo worked non-stop. There was a line at the pumps, and Arden was selling fuel at a price 3 times lower than the Baron's, and still turning a profit because his fuel cost him nothing but hospitality. The nighttime intake on the very first night the caravans arrived exceeded 500 liters. The system was flooding them with notifications. Total stock, 6,007. Sarah found Arden by the well. She silently took a mug, drew water from her own stream, drank it, and said that a month ago she hadn't believed a single word he'd said. She said that now she would bring the entire guild here, and that the guild knew how to be grateful. Then she lowered her voice and asked point blank where the fuel actually came from. Arden looked at the woman who had led 60 people to him across the forbidden route and decided that the legend about the stash had served its purpose. He told her the truth about the system, about the inflow. about how every sleeping guest fills the tanks. Syra listened without interrupting, her face impassive. Then she began to laugh. She laughed for a long time until she was in tears and said that for 20 years she'd been hauling metal through death. But it turned out that the most valuable cargo in the wasteland was simply living people under one roof. She said that such a secret could neither be kept nor revealed. It could only be protected. That same night, Yuna's reconnaissance team returned from the east, and the merriment came to an end. Yuna walked into the store, black with dust, and placed a large caliber shell casing on the table. She said that the Baron's citadel was standing empty, having lost a third of its garrison. Crow spoke up. The convoy was already on the highway. She'd been counting the vehicles from the ridge all night. 18 escort vehicles, a commander's all-terrain vehicle, 2 flatbed trucks with something covered by tarps, and a fuel tanker, empty, judging by how low it sat, a battering ram. Selma asked about the timeline. Yuna replied that at their speed, it would take 3 days, maybe 2 if the Baron pushed them through the night. Arden looked out the north window. There, beyond the wall, a distant light pulsed in the darkness, a light that had grown closer and brighter over the past few days. The system generated a report upon request, and the dry lines exuded a chill. The Baron's convoy's estimated time of arrival was between 48 and 72 hours. Estimated arrival of the anomalous storm, 60 to 80 hours. Probability of the events intersecting in the node zone, over 70%. Update. The energy signature of the storm's core has intensified. The degree of overlap with the node's signature has been refined, 61%. Hypothesis. The object inside the storm is a node or a fragment of a previous generation node. Arden reread the last line 3 times. A node from the previous generation. That means his station isn't the only one. That means somewhere in the heart of the unreadable storm, something had been operating and accumulating data for 40 years and was now heading toward him. He brought everything before the council without holding anything back, in the presence of Sayra's senior caravan leaders. The wasteland does not forgive secrets among people behind the same wall. The council deliberated until late into the night. There was nowhere to run. Old people and children traveled with the caravans, while the storm blocked the north and west. All they could do was stand their ground. They pieced together a plan from whatever they had. Hedgehogs and a cable against the battering ram. Hammers and pickup trucks would serve as a mobile fist outside the gates. Kestra's archers and the caravan guards would man the walls. A smoke screen for the first assault. A shield for the final hour. Selma took on the most delicate task. She knew the voices of half the convoy's mechanics and asked for one night and a radio tuned to the Citadel's frequency. She said that the Barons would be led into battle by men who hadn't seen a full tank or clean water in a year. She said that on the other side of the sights, there was thirst, too. At dawn, Arden climbed the watchtower alone. In the east, above the highway, the convoy's distant dust already hung like a dirty finger swiped across the sky. The Baron's convoy arrived at sunset on the second day, and the wasteland knew about it before the people did. The ground by the eastern wall began to tremble slightly an hour before the dust appeared, and the mugs on the tables at the crossroads clinked as they do before a storm. Yuna struck the gong with 2 long blows. A battle alert without panic. Everyone at the crossroads knew their place after 3 days of drills, and the station reorganized in 20 minutes. The children and elderly from the caravans went to the store's basement and the living module. Kestra's sentries took up positions along the wall at regular intervals. The Hammer, with Wren's crew, took up a position behind the gates in the dead zone. Pike took up a position in the pit with the cable lever. Selma sat in the van by the radio with an earpiece in her ear. Arden climbed the tower and watched as the might of the old world crawled out of the dust. The convoy moved with both beauty and menace. 18 escort vehicles in 2 columns. Between them, the commander's all-terrain vehicle, black and sleek as a beetle. Following were 2 platforms covered with tarps. Bringing up the rear was a fuel tanker, Its 30-metric-ton hull swayed on its springs, easily confirming Yuna's words about the empty tanks. The convoy came to a halt 800 steps and turned in an arc, encircling the station from the east and south. No one turned off their engines. Arden looked at this semicircle of running machinery and couldn't suppress a wry smile. More than 50 people and 22 vehicles were positioned within its expanded perimeter, which, after 100 residents, had stretched to 400 steps. The Baron had led the largest influx in the history of Crossroads to its gates, and he didn't even realize it. The system was already recalculating the figures, and the forecast column for the night's intake was creeping towards 700 liters. Locke stepped out of the all-terrain vehicle, still wearing the same suit, accompanied by a man whom Arden was seeing for the first time, but recognized immediately. Baron Crow turned out to be short and stocky, with the face of an accountant and the eyes of a man who had long since resolved all moral questions in his own favor. He didn't shout through a megaphone. He walked 100 paces toward the gate, accompanied by 6 guards, stopped, and spoke in a normal voice, knowing he would be heard. He said he was impressed. He said that in 40 years of the wasteland, no one had built anything like this, and that destroying it would be a waste. He offered new terms, better than the previous ones. 1/3 of the fuel instead of half. The garrison to be stationed outside the walls rather than inside. And for the station's owner, the title of Governor of the North and a seat at the Citadel's table. He spoke sensibly, calmly, and persuasively, and in this, he was more terrifying than Garm with his megaphone. Arden replied from the watchtower just as calmly. He asked why the Baron needed 1/3 of someone else's fuel when his own tank was 2/3 empty. A stir ran through the convoy. The guards exchanged glances. Crow was silent for a second, and that second cost him more than his entire convoy. Then he said he was sorry and walked toward the all-terrain vehicle without looking back. Locke lingered and shouted that the station still had time until dawn. The night of the blockade became the strangest night of Crossroads life. The two camps lay 400 paces apart in the headlights, and no one fired a shot. But in Selma's earpiece, a second war was raging. Selma came on the Citadel frequency with a voice recognized by half the convoy's mechanics and began to speak. She called people by name. She asked mechanic Jurgen if they had finally fixed his teeth, as they'd promised 3 years ago. She asked driver Moss if his daughter had received her medicine for sand fever, or if the medicine had once again been taken by the Baron's guards. She explained that at the Crossroads, water from the well was free, and that a mechanic here earned more in a single shift than in a month at the Citadel. The frequency was jammed. She changed the frequency. They found her again and jammed it. She switched to a third frequency. By midnight, the Baron's radio operator had lost his voice from cursing, and something that couldn't be jammed was creeping through the convoy. Conversations. Meanwhile, Arden sat by the core, solving the problem on which everything depended. The system showed a total reserve of 9,000 liters. A full perimeter shield now cost 150 liters per activation. The shield consumed 1,000 liters per hour. But Arden had been rereading the system's main line all evening. With a reserve of 10,000 liters and 100 residents, the blueprint for the external terminal became available. The external terminal allowed the fuel dispensing point to be moved beyond the walls. Arden stared at that line, and the plan that had seemed madness yesterday was becoming a calculated move today. You can't defeat 50 barrels head-on, but you can make it so the barrels don't want to fire. At dawn, the Baron didn't start with a battering ram. The tarps were ripped off the platforms, and Crossroads saw what Crow had saved for last. On the platforms stood 2 old-world mortar mounts. Locke stepped forward with a white flag and announced the terms one last time. Surrender by noon. Otherwise, the station would be demolished from a distance without a single casualty for the Baron. The council gathered right on the wall behind the sandbags. Kestra said the platforms were 800 paces away, and her rifles wouldn't be able to hit them accurately. Eunice said that the hammer's sortie against the mortars, backed by 18 vehicles, was a beautiful suicide mission. Selma remained silent, listening to her earpiece, and then raised her hand, and everyone fell silent. She said that Jurgen had just tuned into her frequency on his own. He was the first. He asked if it was true that mechanics were given housing at the crossroads. He added that the mines had been loaded onto the launchers in his presence, and that, out of 40 mines, half had gotten damp in the Citadel's basements 10 years ago. The Baron was half bluffing. But the mortars were real, and the first test shot proved it. The mine landed 50 paces short of the wall and sent a column of sand higher than the watchtower. The second one flew over the wall and exploded in the courtyard near the smithy. The blast threw Dagvo onto the anvil. Mera and Ortiz's daughter dragged the blacksmith down to the basement, still alive but dazed, with his back lacerated. The third mine failed to explode. It stuck in the sand near the well and remained standing with its tail pointing upward like a poisonous flower. Half of the damp ammunition had been confirmed, but even that half was enough to turn the crossroads into a sieve in a single day. And then Arden made a move that the council hadn't approved, because he'd come up with it between the second and third explosions. He ordered the gates opened. He drove out of the gates alone in Ortiz's slow-moving tractor, pulling a trailer that left both camps speechless. On the trailer stood a 1,000-liter tank full of fuel, and next to it, a barrel of water from the well. He drove slowly, straight toward the convoy line, under the crosshairs of 50 gun barrels, and stopped exactly halfway between the armies. From then on, he didn't speak to the Baron. He stood on the trailer and addressed the convoy. He said there were 1,000 liters of fuel and water here. He said this was payment, not to the Baron, but to the people. Every crew that turned off their engine right then and drove south would receive 50 liters on the spot, plus as much water as they could carry. Every mechanic and driver who wants to stay at the crossroads will get housing, a job, and a share, just like everyone else. He said that the Baron pays them with empty promises from an empty tanker, but he pays up front, and here you can come right up and smell the gasoline. The wind carried the scent of 92-octane gasoline toward the convoy. For half a minute, there was such silence that you could hear the tractor's metal cooling down. Then, on the left flank, an engine stalled. The sound was faint, but it struck both camps like a gunshot. The pickup truck pulled out of the arc, turned around, pulled up to the trailer, and the unshaven driver silently handed over the jerry cans. Arden personally poured 50 liters into it. A second engine cut out, then a third. Locke was yelling and waving his pistol around. The Baron's guards raised their guns on their own men, and that was the last straw. The crews who were still hesitating saw that the Baron was ready to shoot them if they tried to leave, and the formation fell apart. 8 vehicles headed south with full fuel cans. 3 vehicles, led by Jurgen, drove through the crossroads gate amid jeers and whistles from the walls. The Baron was left with 7 security vehicles, an all-terrain vehicle, mortars, and a fuel truck. It was still a formidable force, but no longer an army, just a rabid gang. And Crow did what an accountant does when his balance sheet is in the red. He ordered the battering ram to advance immediately, and the mortars to fire into the square. The fuel truck roared to life and barreled toward the gates, picking up speed, and Arden on the tractor barely managed to get out of its way and back inside. After that, everything became a chaotic mess. Shells were landing all over the courtyard. Pike's cable intercepted the fuel truck, but the empty 30-metric-ton hulk snapped the cable like a thread, losing only its bumper. Dagvo's hedgehog slashed its front tires, but the tanker plowed forward on its rims. The gate took the brunt of the impact and collapsed inward along with a section of the wall. The remnants of the Baron's security detail followed the fuel truck through the breach. They were met by the hammer. Ren rammed a captured armored vehicle into the side of the first pickup truck, plugging the breach with an iron cork. Kestra, from the wall, took out everything that moved beyond the breach. Finn and Ortiz, along with their men, fired point point blank. The melee at the breach lasted 8 minutes and was the most terrifying in the station's history. Crossroads lost 3 men in it: a young gunner from the caravan, Ordis's eldest son, and Pike. Pike leaped out of the pit with a tire iron to plug the breach next to Wren, and a burst of fire from the Baron's all-terrain vehicle tore him in half. Una saw this from the watchtower and continued firing until, within a minute, Crow's all-terrain vehicle was left without windows, without a radiator, and without a driver. The Baron was dragged out of the vehicle by his own bodyguards and thrown onto the sand with his hands raised, because by then the mortars had fallen silent. The platform crews were the first to flee, even before the Ark had collapsed. By noon, it was all over. The breach was still smoldering. Mines and dead bodies lay scattered across the courtyard. The Crossroads force of 106 had been reduced to 103. Arden stood over Pike's body and didn't hear the system spewing out lines about the highest tactical assessment, the captured fuel truck, and the blueprint of the external terminal. Una knelt down next to her brother and didn't cry. She said quietly that Pike was the first to believe in this station, back when there were only rusty gas pumps here. They buried the 3 at sunset, behind the northern wall, facing the highway, just as caravan drivers are buried. The entire Crossroads stood in silence, and that silence was an oath. Meanwhile, the bound Baron Crow sat by the breach, staring at the pumps, where even now a line of vehicles waited to refuel, and asked Arden, who was passing by, almost resentfully, where all this fuel had come from. Arden looked at the man responsible for Pike's death and replied that people make fuel. It was just that the Baron had spent his whole life confusing the words to own and to make. By nightfall, the system had finished its calculations. The remnants of the captured guard, the captured vehicles, and the fuel truck spent the night within the perimeter. Inflow, 820 liters. And then the system added a line that wasn't about fuel. An anomalous storm had entered the outer radius. Estimated time of entry into the node zone, 30 hours. The signal from the core had changed. Now 2 words: air, prepare. The morning after the victory was not a morning of victors. Crossroads patched the breach silently and angrily. The sequence of those 30 hours remained in Arden's memory as 4 images. Here is Jürgen, along with the Baron's mechanics, rebuilding the gate and working as if they could sew yesterday back together with stitches. Here is Una, sitting on her brother's watchtower with his wrench on her lap, while all of Crossroads brings her food she won't eat. Here is Mera, tending to the concussed Dagvo, who still reaches for the hammer with his left hand. Here is the captive Baron, under guard, hauling sandbags toward the breach, while the caravan children watch in silence, and grown-ups. Sarah suggested hanging the Baron by the highway for the sake of science. The council argued for an hour. Arden decided otherwise and explained it to everyone. A dead crow is a holy martyr to his sons in the citadel and eternal war. A living crow hauling sandbags marks the end of the legend of the Lord of the Wasteland. The Baron was left as a laborer under supervision, just as Garm's people once were. Wren, who had been entrusted with supervision, looked at the prisoner with the strange expression of a man who had seen his own past. By noon, the system demanded attention. The storm alert was now being updated every half hour. The front's speed had doubled. The sand wall was 2 kilometers high. The front was 40 kilometers wide. Inside was a stable energy core moving against the wind. Arden reread the last word 3 times. Against the wind. The storm's core wasn't moving with the storm. The core was moving on its own, while the storm moved around it like an entourage. Arden convened the council and laid everything out, including the words air and prepare. The council was silent for a long time. Then Mara spoke of what the elders of Route 40 had been whispering about for 40 years. She explained that before the collapse, there had been a research city in the north called Helios Station, where they produced fuel from air and light. When the world collapsed, the city sealed itself off with a dome and vanished in the very first great storm. The caravans that set out to search for Helios Helios never returned. Selma added that her husband had believed in Helios and said that all the pre-war gas stations were branches of a single power grid. Arden listened, a chill running down his spine. His station was a branch. The main line led to him. They prepared for the storm as if for an assault, because the rest of Crossroads wasn't trained for it. Vehicles into the bays and under the awnings. Cover the well with a sand shield. Get people into the module and basements. Stockpile water in all rooms. Kestra voiced what half the station was thinking. She asked whether they shouldn't meet the eye of the storm with a smokescreen and mines, since it had ordered them to prepare. Arden replied with a question. He asked whether the entity that had hidden the city behind a wall of sand for 40 years would ask for permission if it wanted to kill them. It wasn't threatening, it was warning. The difference between a threat and a warning is the difference between a wolf and a guard. The storm came at night, and none of the old men's stories had prepared them for this. First, the wind died down, completely. The wasteland froze in a dead calm, and you could hear the cooling stones creaking. Then a sound came from the north, not a howl, but a low, steady rumble that made the tin sheets of the wall tremble and set teeth chattering. Then the stars vanished. A wall of sand rose from the ground to the sky. And within it, at a height of perhaps 100 or 300 meters, a light pulsed steadily. The group huddled together in the module and basements, as close as a single family. Arden stayed by the core near the cash register because he felt he had to be there. The system switched to continuous output. Contact in 10 minutes. In 5. In 1 minute. The outer perimeter was covered. And then something happened that no one had expected. The storm bypassed the station. A wall of sand reached the outer perimeter 400 paces away and split like a river around an island. The sand roared to the left and right in solid black streams, while above the crossroads stood a clear sky full of stars. The station found itself in the eye of the storm, inside a perfect circle of silence. And then, along that circle of silence, a light made its way toward the gates. It moved across the ground. Arden emerged from the basement because the system had spoken a single word: come out. He stepped out to the shattered gates, defying every rule, and saw a visitor. A vehicle that shouldn't have existed was moving across the dead sand toward the station. A low platform without wheels, floating half a meter above the ground in a cocoon of faint light. Standing on the platform was a human-sized cylinder made of old copper-colored metal, covered in scars and dents from 40 years on the road. The platform stopped 10 steps away from Arden, and the cylinder spoke. The voice sounded like the system's, but older, lower, cracked. It identified itself as the keeper of Node 01 at Helios Station. It said it had been traveling for 40 years along the dead network, from node to node, finding nothing but the wrecks of stations. Looted, burned, forgotten. Grandfather Ivo's node was the last one in the registry to respond to a ping at least once a year. Arden asked about his grandfather. The keeper paused and replied that operator Ivo had kept the node in sleep mode for 30 years, powered solely by his own breath, because he knew that a sleeping node cannot be looted and a dead one cannot be revived. He had been waiting for an heir with sufficient power to awaken it. He didn't even make it through a single year. Arden stood there, realizing that all of his grandfather's letters, all the schematics, and all 8 years of preparation had not been the whims of an old man. His grandfather hadn't been preparing a refueling kit for him. His grandfather had been preparing a post for him. The caretaker continued, and every word he spoke changed the scale of the world. Helios is alive. Under the dome to the north, reactors are operating, and the descendants of the staff, 900 people, live there. But the dome is dying. Its protective shield will fail in 2 years, and the city will suffocate in the sand. Salvation exists, and it is called the power grid. If the chain of nodes from Helios to the south is restored, the city will be able to move people and production along a protected corridor, and the grid will revive the wasteland with water and fuel for 1,000 kilometers. This requires a functioning anchor node with a live feed and an operator. The overseer had been searching for such a node for 40 years. He said he'd found one. Then he named his price, and the price hit like a blow. For anchor synchronization, the node must reach third rank. Third rank means 300 permanent residents, 50 vehicles, and a daily inflow of 2,000 liters. The deadline is the end of the dome's operational life, and the synchronization will be visible to the entire network, to all the surviving fragments of the old world that can tune into the airwaves. And not all of them are friends. The keeper said outright that in the south, beyond the salt lakes, something calling itself the Consortium is already listening to the airwaves, and that the Consortium is gathering old nodes by forcibly burning through their inflow and hauling away their cores. Arden asked why the keeper was sure he could handle it. The cylinder paused and replied that he wasn't sure, but over the course of 40 years, he'd seen 100 camps where fuel was guarded, and one node where fuel was shared. The network isn't built on guarding. The network is built on exchange. Operator Evo wrote this in his final report and asked that it be passed on to the heir should one appear. The keeper extended a tray from the platform, and on the tray lay a core the size of a fist, warm as if alive. The network's backup key. With it, a node gained the right to call upon other nodes. Arden took the core in both hands, and the system erupted with lines of text. Network key accepted. Node promoted to anchor candidate status. Registry of dormant nodes within communication range opened. 4 dormant nodes detected. Attention! Activity detected from an unknown node to the south. Node is not responding to handshake. Node is scanning. The Watcher said he would remain at the station until synchronization, because his platform alone generates an influx equivalent to 5 machines. Then he added one last thing. The storm around him is both his shield and his curse. The field generator has been broken for 40 years and won't shut off. He can only lead the storm in his wake. That's why the Watcher's path is visible to all, while the road behind him is overgrown with sand. By dawn, the storm had moved east, skirting the station by memory of the field, and the crossroads emerged from the basements into a world that had grown 1,000 times larger. People stood and looked at the copper cylinder by the speakers, at the clear circle of sand around the walls, and at Arden, holding the warm core in his hands. Syra was the first to break the silence. She asked what would happen now. Arden looked north, where, beyond the horizon, a city of 900 people was dying beneath a dome. Then he looked south, where someone nameless was scanning their airwaves. Then he looked at his station, where 103 people lived, but 300 were needed. He replied that now they would not be building a crossroads. Now they would be building a capital. The word capital turned out to be easier to say than to bring to life. A week after the storm had passed, the crossroads was bursting at the seams from its own growth. Rumors of the station that had captivated the Baron and tamed the great storm achieved what no old-world advertisement ever could. People poured in. Within a month, the population had surpassed 180, and Arden later recalled that month's construction as one long day. Here's Jurgen and his crew installing the second living module and laying the foundation for the third without waiting for orders. Here's Dagvo, already forging hinges with both hands for the new gate out of a fuel truck's frame. Here's the Overseer hanging over the well, and his platform has repaired the pump overnight so that the water flow has doubled. Here's Yuna, who since Pike's death barely speaks, silently taking command of 20 fighters and driving them to the point of exhaustion. The problems were growing faster than the modules. Food became the top priority. 150 mouths were eating through the caravan's supplies faster than trade could replenish them, and Mara was the first to utter the dreaded word hunger at the council meeting. The solution was found where no one was looking. The caretaker, having overheard the council's debate, casually mentioned that there was a blueprint for a hydroponic farm in the anchor node's package, and that it could be unlocked early for 5,000 liters from the reserve. The council gasped at the price. Arden paid without haggling, and 2 weeks later, in the former warehouse under the light of car headlights, the first trays turned green. Old woman Mara walked among the trays, touching the living leaves and speaking to the plants in the language of her youth. The second problem was authority. As long as Crossroads had 40 people, everyone knew everyone else. Once the group reached 200, thefts, squabbles, and the first knife fight over a woman began. The council established a court of 5 elected members, and the very first trial proved to be a test. They tried one of Garm's former men who had stolen medicine. According to the laws of the highway, such an offense was punishable by death. Ren stood up and asked to speak. He said that he himself had come here as an enemy with a weapon and had been given a job instead of a knife. He offered the thief a year of hard labor on the farm under his supervision and put his own head on the line as collateral. The council agreed, and Crossroads gained what the wasteland lacked, a law that was more valuable than revenge. The third problem was the South. The consortium's hub scanned the airwaves every night with increasing intensity, and caravans from the South brought the first eyewitness accounts. The consortium turned out to be not a gang, but a machine. A former military logistics center ruled by a man who called himself the Director. They didn't burn down camps. They would arrive, offer a contract, and the camp would sign because camps that refused would immediately stop receiving ammunition, food, and spare parts along all southern routes. Then consortium engineers would enter the camp, cut out the node core they found, and haul it south, while the people were relocated to work zones under the terms of the contract. Syra listened to these stories, her face darkening. Her guild had traveled along the southern roads as well. Arden's response to the south was asymmetrical. He did not send out a reconnaissance mission. Instead, he opened an external terminal. The blueprint obtained during the battle with the Baron was brought to life in 10 days at the mouth of the old riverbed near the Targ outpost. A concrete block, a column, a canopy, and a tank connected to the core, the first branch in the wasteland. Now caravans could refuel without reaching the station, and Targ, along with his men, became the first garrison of the first trading post, and no longer hid whose side it stood. Trade volume doubled in a month, and then a letter arrived. It was delivered by a dapper courier on an electric buggy in pristine condition. The envelope was made of paper and sealed with wax, just like in ancient books. The director wrote politely and articulately. He congratulated Operator Arden on the node's activation. He proposed a meeting on neutral territory near the Salt Lakes to discuss the division of spheres of influence. And in the last paragraph, as if in passing, he mentioned that the consortium possessed 7 node cores and materials from the pre-war network registry, including a complete dossier on the Helios node and the forced synchronization protocols. After reading the letter through his sensor, the keeper was silent for a long time. Then he said that the forced synchronization protocols were a myth, but a dangerous one. A node cannot be synchronized by force, but a node can be cut out and connected to another network like a battery. 7 extracted cores means 7 destroyed stations, and if the director collects 10, he'll be able to build his own network. A network where nodes don't generate inflow, but squeeze it out. The council debated the meeting for 3 evenings. Yuna was against it, arguing that people are killed more often on neutral territory than in war. Sarah was in favor and argued that not knowing the enemy is more dangerous. Arden's decision surprised them both. He agreed to the meeting, but scheduled it not at the Salt Lakes, but at his outer terminal. Let the director travel along the road where Arden's station refuels, past the outpost that Arden's station supplies. Let him take a look. The director arrived 2 weeks later in 3 vehicles and turned out to be a tall, gaunt old man with the manners of an old-world university professor. He never once made a threat. He walked around the terminal, touched the concrete, praised the welding, and offered compliments that carried the weight of lead. Then they sat down at a table under a canopy, and the director laid out the maps. Detailed power grid maps. Arden saw his station as a tiny dot on a branch, and the branch as part of a web that had once covered the entire continent. The director spoke for an hour, and he spoke with frightening intelligence. He said that the grid needed a center and discipline, that the romance of independent stations would end with the very first major war over control nodes, that Helios, with its 900 outlets, was a millstone around the neck, not a goal, and that he was offering Arden not subordination, but a partnership. The director's southern grid and Arden's northern branch, a border along the Salt Lakes, an exchange of technologies, and let Helios solve its own problems. Arden listened and realized that he wasn't facing a villain from the fairy tales of the highway. He was facing logic. The cold, mature logic of a world where resources are scarcer than people. And the only way to respond to it was with another kind of logic. Arden asked the director how much fuel his 7 excised cores produced. The director replied proudly that they produced a total of 400 liters per day. Arden nodded and said that his single node produced 1,200. He explained why. A harvested core is dead and runs on its last reserves, like a battery. A living node grows along with the people. The director's 7 destroyed stations produce 1/3 as much as a single living one. He placed his plywood sheet with the monthly inflow figures next to the director's maps. The curve shot up like a rocket. Then he said the most important thing. He wasn't offering the director a border. He was offering the director a choice. One the director had never allowed others to have. The consortium could become a node in the network, a living one, with an inflow from trade and a share in the Helios corridor. To do this, they'd have to stop cutting out cores and start awakening them, or the consortium will remain a buyer of dead batteries, and in 2 years, when Arden's network reaches the southern roads, all of the director's caravans will refuel at other people's terminals. The director remained silent, staring at the inflow curve. His expression didn't change, but his fingers slowly folded the pre-war map. He said he'd heard him. He said the consortium would consider it. He left without saying goodbye, and Targ, watching the convoy depart, spat and said that people like that don't think. People like that calculate. And he added that this old man knows how to calculate better than anyone else in the South. That same night, the system indicated that the scan of the airwaves from the south had ceased. The caretaker said that this was worse than a scan. It meant that the director had learned everything he wanted to know. 3 days later, dormant node number 2 from the station's registry stopped responding to pings. The node was located in the southwest, in the ruins of a grain silo 6 days' journey away. The caretaker retrieved the latest telemetry data, which showed a 1-second unauthorized connection before the silence set in, the consortium's handiwork. The director made his move without words. He began the race for the dormant nodes. The council convened at midnight. On Grandpa Ivo's map, 4 points representing dormant nodes were lit up, and 1 was already in enemy hands. Arden looked at the 3 remaining ones and realized that the era of siege was over for good. Whoever controls the nodes controls the roads. You can't build a network while sitting behind a wall. He told the council that Crossroads was heading out onto the highway. An expedition to the nearest dormant node would set out in a week, and he himself would lead it. The expedition set out at dawn on the 7th day in 2 columns, and Crossroads saw it off with its entire population at the new gates. streets. The convoy was assembled like a weapon, the hammer under Wren's command, Selma's van with her tools and radio, Kestra's captured pickup truck with a turret, the refueling vehicle assembled by Jurgen from half of the Baron's fuel tanker, and the overseer's platform, which brought up the rear because they'd decided not to take the storm to the dormant node, and for the first time in 40 years, the overseer had untethered the field from himself, leaving the storm to circle around the crossroads like a guard dog. Arden left the station in the hands of Yuna and Syra, and that decision was harder for him than the preparations. Yuna accepted command in silence, only as a farewell. For the first time since her brother's death, she spoke a long sentence to Arden. She said that Pike had been the first to believe in the station, and if Arden were to die somewhere in the sands, all of her brother's faith would be devalued, so he must return. The destination lay 4 days' journey to the northwest. According to the registry, Node Number 3 was located in a small town near a pre-war pumping station by a dried-up river. The road stretched out like a construction site. Here the convoy passes through a field of dead wind turbines, and the blades creak overhead like the unlubricated gates of heaven. Here Kestra picks up 2 observers from a sand dune, and from the markings on their motorcycles, everyone recognizes the consortium's long-range reconnaissance team, which had been traveling the same route. Here they spend the night in a circle of vehicles, where Jurgen's mechanic feeds all engines, while the overseer tells stories by the fire about the old world in a voice that makes even the veterans listen like children. On the 3rd day, the convoy reaches the bed of a dead river, and on the opposite bank, everyone sees the city. The city was alive. It wasn't listed in the registry. People lived around the pre-war pumping station behind a riverstone embankment, watchtowers made of piles, vegetable gardens on the old silt, 1,500 people, according to Kestra's estimate, and a flag on the pumping tower, a faded blue banner with a white wave. The supervisor scanned it and reported something strange. Node Number 3 was asleep, but not properly. Someone had been manually keeping it in sleep mode for all 40 years, just like Grandpa Ivo. The convoy was met at the crossing by gun barrels, but no shots were fired. The elder stepped forward. A sturdy woman in her 60s named Yvette, with the hands of a bricklayer. The conversation was brief and tense. Yvette said she knew who they were. Rumors of the fire station had reached them here as well. She said that the town of Wells needed neither other people's wars nor other people's miracles. They had their own water from a deep aquifer, their own vegetable gardens, and their own peace for 40 years. She said that the node under the pump house was their node, and that their guardian grandfather had also left behind commandments. The main commandment was simple: do not wake it. The guardian grandfather of Wells had witnessed a war over fuel and decided that a sleeping node would kill no one. Arden stood before a copy of his own history turned inside out and didn't know what to say. Selma spoke up. She asked Yvette how many children had been born in Wells over the past year. Yvette paused and replied that 4 had been born and 11 had died. Selma nodded and said that peace was also a way to die, just a slow one. The town let the convoy in for a day, in accordance with the Dead River's law of hospitality. And during that day, something happened that Arden later called a battle won not by force. Jurgen and the mechanics overhauled the town's water pump, which had been wheezing for the past year, for free. Mara dictated recipes over the radio to the local herbalist for treating the bone fever that had been ravaging the elderly in Wells. Kestra went out with the local patrols to the far outpost and showed them how to set up cross-cover sectors. And in the evening, Arden simply opened the fuel dispenser and filled every one of Wells's vehicles to the brim, without calling it a payment or a gift. He called it what it was: an exchange between neighbors. That night, Yvette came over to their campfire on her own. She sat down, stared at the embers, and asked why he needed their node when he already had his own. Arden told her everything about Helios and the dome that had 2 years left, about the 900 people, about the network that would either come to life as a chain of free stations or become the director's chain, where nodes are cut out like organs. He said he had no intention of awakening the Wells node against the city's will. He had come to offer Wells what he offered everyone, to become a station in the network voluntarily, with its own operator from among their own people and with protection for the entire branch, or not to join, in which case he would leave, and in a month or a year, consortium engineers would arrive here and would no longer ask. Yvette was silent for a long time. Then she said that the ancestors' precepts were written for a world where a node was a curse. Perhaps a world had come where a node had become a wellspring. She said she would convene the city council. The Wells Circle deliberated for a day and reached the decision that all people who are faced with a choice ultimately reach. The node was awakened at sunset in full view of the entire city. The operator was the granddaughter of the Guardian's grandfather, a girl named Tilo, who was the only one who could read his notebooks. When the Wells system came to life and the first digit of the inflow hovered in the air above the old pump house, the town screamed so loudly that birds flew up from the towers. The caretaker performed the pairing, and in the AR registry, a second live dot lit up. The network ceased to be a station. The network became a line. And an hour later, Selma's radio station picked up a transmission from the crossroads, and Yuna's voice was as steady as it had been before the battle. She was transmitting in plain text because there was no cipher anyway. From the south, a consortium convoy of 20 vehicles, including engineering transport, approached the outer terminal. They did not attack. They stopped a kilometer away and began construction. Within a day, they had set up a watchtower, a checkpoint, and their own relay station right on the southern road, within clear sight of the Targa trading post. They announced prices half those of the crossroads. The trade war began without a single shot fired. The Expedition Council gathered around the fire. Ren said we needed to go back and crush the checkpoint before it became entrenched. Kestra agreed. Selma asked how the director could offer prices half the cost of goods sold, and answered her own question. With cores. He's burning through a stockpile of 7 dead cores to buy roads. This isn't trade. It's a siege by wallet. And then the overseer, who had been silent throughout the entire council meeting, spoke up. He said that the pre-war registry contained something he hadn't mentioned before because he didn't believe it was feasible. Node number 4, the last dormant node on this branch, is no ordinary node. It's a hub, a second-order distribution hub, capable of supplying terminals along 100 kilometers of roads and setting prices for the entire branch. Whoever controls the hub wins any trade war because their cost price becomes 0 across the entire radius. The problem is where the hub is located. The overseer pulled up a map and a hush fell over the group. Node number 4 lay in the ghost town of Carages, the very town through which not a single caravan had passed in 20 years. People went out of their way to avoid the city, not because of bandits, but because not even bandits ever returned from there. The old-timers of the trail spoke of Carages with a single phrase, the Singing Sands. Yvette, who had been seeing the council off by the fire, turned pale at the mention of that name and said that her father had been on the last expedition there 40 years ago. He returned alone, his hair turned white, and until his dying day, he repeated that the sands of Carages sing with voices, and that the sand there moves on its own. The caretaker added a terse line that only made things worse. The telemetry for Node 4 was last updated 39 years ago. The latest data packet contained an activated protocol that wasn't in his libraries. The protocol's name consisted of 2 words, autonomous defense. Arden stared into the fire and counted. Behind him lay the crossroads, suffocating under the weight of prices. Ahead lay the hub that would decide everything, and the city from which no one returns. The director had surely read the same logs and had surely already come to the same conclusion. The race was no longer for the dormant nodes. The race was for caravans. In the morning, the convoy split up for the first time since the expedition began. The refueler, along with half the security detail and the contract for Wells, headed home to help Una wage the trade war. Meanwhile, the Hammer, Selma's van, Kestra's pickup, and the overseer's flatbed turned northwest, toward the city of Singing Sands lying beyond the sand dunes. As a parting gift, Tilo gave Arden her grandfather's notebook. On the last page, written in the old Guardian's hand, were the words, large and crooked, "If you go to Caragez, go as if you're deaf. The sands sing only to those who listen." They approached Caragez on the third day, and the city did not appear all at once, but in pieces. First, the skeletons of grain silos rose from the sand dunes, then the ribs of a bridge spanning a dead river, then the city itself, gray and intact to the point of seeming unreal. Houses stood with windows, poles with wires. In the square at the entrance, a column of old-world cars stood motionless, lined up as straight as in a parade. 40 years of desolation had stripped everything down to the last screw, yet Caragez stood untouched, and that very untouchedness sent a chill down our spines. We prepared ourselves according to the notebook of the old custodian, to walk as if deaf. Selma molded earplugs out of wax and rags for everyone, including herself. The caretaker explained the old master's theory based on a scrap of the protocol. The autonomous defense system of Node 4 was acoustic, infrasound, and directed frequencies. The sands of Caragez sang, literally. Resonators buried along the city's perimeter led uninvited guests in circles, disrupted their sense of direction, and, at close range, shattered their consciousness with fear until their hearts stopped. The hub was defenseless against bullets. Against people, it had been invincible for 40 years. They left the vehicles behind the bridge to Ren, along with half the fighters. 5 of them went in on foot. Arden, Selma with her instrument, Kestra with her rifle, and Silent Finn, who had tagged along since the crossroads and suddenly turned out to be their trump card, because Finn, deaf and mute from birth, was the only one whom the Song of the Sands did not affect at all, and the Watcher's platform creeping among them. Inside, the city was a museum of the end of the world. In the bakery, petrified loaves of bread lay on trays. In a school classroom, a math lesson remained on the blackboard. There were no residents, no bodies, no traces of battle. The Watcher scanned the area and said quietly that the city had been evacuated a day before the defenses were activated. The people had left alive. It was just that no one had ever been able to return. With wax in his ears, the world felt muffled and all the more terrifying for it. Arden sensed the song through his earplugs, not with his ears, but with his body. His chest trembled slightly. His teeth ached. In the 4th block, voices began. The wax muffled the sound, but couldn't block what was traveling through the bones of his skull. Arden heard the voice of Grandfather Ivo, calling his name from the alley on the left. Selma stood rooted to the spot, staring into the void of the storefront, where her deceased husband was speaking to her. Kestra spun around and raised her rifle toward the empty street, tears streaming down her face. The resonators unlocked memories and sang to each person of their dead. And then Finn stepped forward. The mute boy, whom the station was considered a freeloader, took Arden by the hand. Arden took Selma. Selma took Kestra. Like a chain, the deaf guide led the hearing ones through the singing city, and Finn walked calmly, as if through his own yard, reading the streets by the sun and the compass needle on his wrist. Thus they walked another 6 blocks. Right at the pumping tower, the defense forces played their last trump card. The frequency changed, and it wasn't voices that emerged from behind the buildings. It was images. His brain, pushed to the limit by infrasound, began to imagine movement in every shadow. Kestra was the first to snap, and fired half her magazine into an empty corner. At the sound of gunfire from a real, not an imagined alley, real people emerged. There were 6 of them, wearing closed-face helmets with active noise cancellation, and the consortium's emblem on their shoulders. The director had sent his men not from the south along the road, but from the west across the dunes, and his engineers were heading toward the hub that very morning. The battle in the Singing City was short and savage. They fired through hallucinations, acting on half-guesses. Kestra wounded 2 before an enemy sniper knocked her rifle out of her hands, along with 2 fingers. Arden took down the lead attacker at point-blank range with a tire iron, and the overseer finished it all off by doing something he hadn't done in 40 years. The platform rose above the street and struck with its own field, out of phase with the city's defense frequency. For half a minute, the song died away. In the deathly silence, the 6 men in helmets, deafened by their own noise cancellation, found themselves more blind than those who could hear, and Finn, with Renova's crowbar, and Selma, who had arrived just in time, finished the fight with ropes rather than bullets. The senior captured engineer, catching his breath, said through clenched teeth that they were too late anyway. The director gave his group a week. After that, the coercion protocol would be initiated remotely. The consortium had spent the entire month building emitters on the western ridge to simply burn down Karagaz's defenses across the entire area along with the hub if the hub didn't fall into their hands intact. The director preferred a dead hub to someone else's living one. They reached the pump tower an hour before sunset. The hub's core stood intact in the machine room, dormant within a ring of 6 resonator columns, and the overseer hovered before it as if before an altar. He said that a key and an operator alone were not enough to awaken the hub. A second-order hub requires an anchor sacrifice, a constant donor of inflow during startup. The nearest active node must give the hub its entire daily inflow for 3 full days, all 2,000 liters, down to 0. Arden understood instantly what that meant. The crossroads, in the midst of a trade war, would have to run dry for 3 days. No cover, no shield, no goods at the pumps. If the director finds out and strikes during those 3 days, there will be nothing to defend the station with. Selma established contact with home by stretching the antenna up the tower. Yuna listened and remained silent for so long that Arden thought the connection had dropped. Then she spoke 3 sentences. She said that the consortium's checkpoint received reinforcements yesterday and now numbers 30 vehicles. She said that if the hub comes back to life, the director's prices will crash within a week, and his financial stranglehold will collapse. And she said that Crossroads will hold out for 3 days, on its last legs, clinging to the walls, and out of sheer defiance, because her brother didn't build this station so she'd be afraid of the dark. The decision was made by the entire council over the radio anyway, and the council said yes. The launch began at midnight. The overseer handled the synchronization. Tilo from Wells maintained her feed. Arden placed his hands on the warm core of the key and felt his station begin to respond 300 kilometers away. The Crossroads inflow figures dropped to 0, and the hub's core grew warm beneath his palms like a heart coming to life. The first day passed in a state of tense anticipation. On the second day, Karagaz began to change around them. The resonators, now under the hub's live control, one by one switched from the song of death to a steady, low tone, and the singing sands, for the first time in 40 years, sang a lullaby instead of a requiem. And as the third day drew to a close, when the synchronization bar crept up to 90%, the radio brought news from the south of what everyone had feared. Yuna's voice, crackling through the static, said that the director had found out. A dry station cannot hide its dryness. A 30-vehicle consortium convoy has left the checkpoint and is heading toward the crossroads. Dawn is approaching. And then a second transmission followed, this time not from Yuna. The director's voice, calm as a dictation, came over the network frequency. He was addressing the operator Arden personally. He said he was impressed by the maneuver with the hub and admitted that he had lost the trade deal. Therefore, the terms were changing. He said that his emitters on the western ridge were not aimed solely at caravans. He gave the coordinates, and the overseer would have turned pale if he were capable of it. The emitters were positioned a day's journey from Wells. The director proposed a simple exchange. Arden would halt the hub's synchronization and hand over caravans. Otherwise, in the morning, the consortium would enter dry crossroads, and the emitters would incinerate Little Wells, which wouldn't even understand what was killing it. The director gave him until dawn to make a decision and signed off. Arden stood in the machine room between the warm, awakening heart of the hub and the cold radio station. Synchronization was at 91%. 9% remained until full awakening, and no one knew how many hours that would take. There were 6 hours left until dawn. Arden spent those 6 hours not choosing between two evils, but searching for a third way, because Grandpa Ivo had written in his letters that a person who chooses between two options that aren't their own has already lost. He gathered everyone at the radio station. Selma, with her arm bandaged after the battle. Kestru, with the stumps of 2 fingers wrapped in bandages. Finn, the overseer. And he asked one question. What do the director's emitters actually fire? The keeper replied that they fired high-powered, directed infrasonic waves across open areas. The same principle as Karagaz's resonators, only cruder and more powerful. And then Selma looked up from her bandage. She said slowly that if the nature is the same, then these aren't 2 different guns. They're 2 instruments in the same orchestra, and the orchestra is now conducted by the hub. The overseer froze for a full minute, which, for a machine, was an eternity. Then he said that the woman was right. After the hub awakens, Karagaz's resonator ring becomes more than just a defense. It becomes an antenna. A second-order hub can enter an alien emitting system of the same nature if the system is active and within range. The emitters on the western ridge were within range, but there was a trap. The hub could only enter them while they were active. In other words, the director had to fire, either at Wells or at Karagaz. And in the first few seconds of the shot, while the emitters were building up power, the hub could seize control and twist their frequency into self-suppression, if the hub had fully awakened by then. 9% synchronization versus 6 hours, and no one knew which would be faster. Arden contacted the director an hour before dawn and spoke with the voice of a weary loser. He said he'd accept half the terms. He couldn't hand over Karagaz because the synchronization couldn't be stopped without destroying the core, and let the director's engineers confirm that. But he was willing to go further. He was willing to hand over all 7 live awakening protocols to the director so that the consortium could revive its dead cores. He asked only that they leave Wells alone and give him until noon to complete the synchronization, after which he would personally meet with consortium representatives in Karagaz to transfer the hub to joint management. He spoke, hating every word he uttered, because those words were exactly half the truth. The director was silent for 2 minutes. Then he said he'd spent half his life waiting for the romantics to start counting. He gave them until noon and added that the convoy at the crossroads would remain at a safe distance as a guarantee. If synchronization wasn't transferred to his engineer's control by noon, the convoy would enter the station and the emitters would fire according to Wells's plan. He went silent, and Arden didn't unclench his fists until a minute later. He'd bought 6 hours. From there on, time condensed into a montage. Here, the overseer is rushing the synchronization by cutting out test cycles and honestly admits that the nodes have never been woken up this way, and there are no guarantees. Here, Selma and Finn are crawling along the resonator columns in the machine room, switching the city's ring from defense mode to antenna mode. According to the diagrams, the overseer is drawing directly with light on the wall. Here, Kestra was learning to shoot from a resting position with one hand, just in case everything collapses and the infantry arrives. Here, Arden contacts Yuna and Tilo and tells them both the same thing. Wells must leave the city for the northern quarries by noon. Everyone, down to the last old man. The group at the crossroads must remain quiet and not give the convoy any cause for alarm until noon. And neither of them is to say a word on the air about what's being prepared, because the airwaves are being monitored. Una replied briefly, in military fashion. Tilo replied that the Wells Circle was already voting with their feet, and that the guardian grandfather had told her as a child that the nodes would one day sing together. Synchronization was creeping along, 94 by sunrise, 96 by mid-morning. At 10 o'clock, it reached 98 and held steady for 40 minutes, and those 40 minutes aged Arden by a year. The overseer found the bottleneck. The hub was missing the final handshake, the third live voice on the network. The intersection was dry and its core was sleeping in power-saving mode. Wells was holding the branch, but 2 second-order hub nodes were insufficient according to protocol. A third source of live traffic within the network's line of sight was required. And then the watcher said quietly that there was a third source. It was himself. His platform was a fragment of Helios and carried within it a dormant zero-rank mobile node. It could be awakened, but the platform had lived for 40 years on this dormant heart, and awakening it would burn out the buffers. The watcher would cease to be a wanderer. He would become part of the hub forever. Immobile. Arden asked if the watcher understood what he was losing. The machine paused and replied that for 40 years it had traveled through a dead network to find a place where the network cared. The journey was not the goal, but the search. The goal had been found, and thus the journey was, by definition, over. He asked for only one thing. When the corridor to Helios is opened, let Arden convey to the city beneath the dome that Node 01 has arrived. At 11:20, the Watcher's platform floated into the center of the machine hall, came to rest between the resonator columns, and descended to the floor for the first time in 40 years. The glow beneath it faded. A wave of warmth swept through the hall, and synchronization shifted out of its deadlock. 99. At 11:50:01, the Caragez hub opened its eyes. It was impossible to describe in numbers, though numbers poured forth like a waterfall. The city sighed. The streetlights in the square, which had been dead for 40 years, flickered and lit up with an even yellow glow. The pump tower hummed deeply and powerfully, and the sands around Caragez sang at the top of their lungs. But the song was different, vast, calm, like the breath of a sleeping giant. The Arden system howled with notifications. Second order hub activated. Network elevated to branch status. Remote terminal control available. Estimated throughput, 2,000 liters per day without an anchor donor. The crossroads has been released. Inflow to the crossroads has been restored. And on a separate line, an external emitting system detected. Western Ridge. Status, standby. At exactly noon, the director came on the line and demanded a report on the transmission. Arden replied that nothing would be transmitted. He said that the hub had awakened and belonged to the network of living nodes. He offered the director, for the last time, the same proposal he'd made at the terminal, to enter the network as a living being. The director paused, and for the first time, his voice lost its even tone. He said he was sorry, and that the lesson would be a vivid one. The emitters of the Western Ridge fired at 12:04. They did not strike Wells. The director was smarter and struck at the source of the problem. Full power was directed at Caragaz across the entire area to burn out both the hub and the people inside it. For the first half-second of the strike, Arden felt in every bone of his body the approach of the end of the world. And then the hub intercepted the wave. The city's resonator ring deflected the foreign wave, captured its frequency, and guided it. The caretaker, who had become the heart of the antenna, reversed the flow into antiphase and drove it back along the beam. On the Western Ridge, 40 kilometers away, the consortium's transmitters received their own strike, amplified, and reversed. The equipment burned out in 9 seconds. The engineers fled from the machines, whose windings were melting. The hub carefully extinguished the wave, and a deafening silence fell over the wasteland. In that silence, Yuna's voice came over the network from the crossroads. She said that the consortium column near the station was withdrawing from its positions and heading south without engaging in battle. She asked what had happened there. Arden stood in the machine room amid the singing columns, next to the motionless platform in which the city's new heart beat steadily and powerfully, and replied that music had happened. The return home took 4 days and felt like a dream. Along the road that the convoy had traveled a month earlier, with weapons at the ready, people now stood every 50 kilometers, waving their hands. Rumors of the night when the sands of Caragaz began to sing anew, and the director's lightning returned to his own emitters, had overtaken the convoy by a day, and become embellished with details beyond recognition. In one version, Arden commanded the storm. In another, the dead city rose to his defense. Selma listened to these retellings at the rest stops and grumbled that in a year's time he'd be walking on water. The crossroads greeted the convoy with its gates wide open and the roar of 200 throats. Yuna stood by the gates, and when Arden jumped down from the hammer, she did something she'd never done before. She hugged him, briefly but tightly, in front of everyone, and whispered in his ear that her brother would have been pleased. Kestru, with her bandaged arm, was practically carried into the module by the women of the caravan. Finn, whom the entire station had previously ignored, was now being patted on the shoulders so vigorously that Mayra had to scold and shoo the grateful crowd away from her patient. The winter of the wasteland began, short and harsh, with black, frosty nights. Arden would later recall this winter as the happiest time of his life. Now the Caragaz hub is remotely powering 3 new terminals along the roads, and the cost of fuel on the route is dropping so much that the caravans are no longer traveling in columns, but in a steady stream. Now the first settlers, 20 families, enter Caragaz, and the once dead city glows with light from its windows in the evenings. And by the keeper's stationary platform, children leave dried berries on a rock as an offering to the city's spirit. And the keeper grumbles over the radio, asking Arden to explain to the people that machines don't eat, yet for some reason he doesn't remove the berries. Now that Wells is close at hand, Tilo sets up the first school on the branch line next to his pumping station, and Yvette sends Arden a pair of dog hair mittens with a random caravan, without a note. Right at the crossroads, they're finishing up the 4th module, and a market under a canopy made from the wing of a pre-war airplane that a scavenger, dazed by his own good fortune, had hauled in from somewhere. By midwinter, the system was showing numbers that Arden gazed at every morning as if they were a miracle. 311 permanent residents across 3 nodes on the branch, 60 vehicles, a daily inflow of 2,400 liters. The 3rd rank had been achieved. Anchor synchronization with Helios had become technically feasible, and the overseer from Caragaz confirmed his readiness to maintain the log. All that remained was to decide when, and Arden hesitated, not even understanding why, until one night when it dawned on him. He was afraid. The synchronization would be visible to the entire surviving network of the continent. The branch would emerge from the shadows forever. And in the south, the director remained silent, and that silence hung over the map like an unexploded mine. The consortium had sent neither a courier nor a threat from beyond the western range. Syra's intelligence reported something strange. The southern roads were emptying. The consortium's contractor camps were being dismantled and pulled back toward the center of the director's domain. It wasn't falling apart, it was clenching into a fist. The response came on the longest night of winter, and it came not from the south, but from the north. The branch's radio operator picked up a faint mechanical signal on the network frequency, repeating at 1-hour intervals. The custodian decoded it in a minute, and for the first time in Arden's memory, the old machine's voice faltered. The signal was coming from Helios, the automatic emergency protocol beacon. The dome was reporting to the network exactly what it had been programmed to report upon reaching the critical threshold. The protective field's remaining lifespan had been recalculated after the winter storms, not 2 years, but 7 months. After that, the dome's degradation would be exponential. The city was requesting an evacuation corridor from any active branch and transmitting the population registry. 941 people. Of those, 217 were children. The branch council convened for the first time in its new composition via the hub, the intersection of Wells Caragaz and the trading posts. Arden laid everything out. 7 months instead of 2 years. A corridor 600 kilometers from Caragaz to the dome, through lands where no caravan trader had ever set foot because great storms had raged there for 40 years. And the director stood behind him, his fist clenched. They argued until morning. Yvette said the branch had barely gotten off the ground, and 900 mouths would tear its economy apart. Targ said that a corridor stretching 600 kilometers couldn't be defended, even with half the Old World's army. Syra remained silent throughout the argument, and then said one thing. She said that for 20 years she'd led caravans past the dying, convincing herself that the cargo was more important. Then she came to the station to see the young boy who'd poured water for her people for free, and her life changed. If the branch were to weigh the options now and refuse, their entire network would be nothing more than a guarded warehouse, and the director would have been right about everything from the very beginning. After these words, they voted in silence, and the decision was unanimous. The branch is opening the northern corridor. It took 2 weeks to put the plan together, and it was madness broken down into reasonable steps. The overseer proposed the backbone of the operation. Along the corridor, at 60-kilometer intervals, small hub beacons based on his field sketches would be set up, 10 in total. Each beacon is a refueling terminal, a radio station, a storm shelter, and, most importantly, a resonator that by linking with neighboring ones creates a field thread. Along this thread, the hub will be able to divert small storms away from the route, just as it has diverted its own for 40 years. The thread won't stop major storms, but Helios has calculated the windows between major storms throughout its entire history and will transmit the schedule. The beacons require metal, people, and time. The metal came from the Pica junkyards and a dismantled consortium checkpoint. The entire branch provided the people. No one provided the time. Construction of the corridor began at the end of winter and went down in the branch's memory as the building of 10 lighthouses. The assembly work during those months would have been endless, so Arden remembered one image for each lighthouse. The first lighthouse was erected in a blizzard, and Jurgen welded the last sheet blindly, relying on touch. At the third one, a floating lens sank into the foundation pit, and Dagvo spent 3 days driving sheet piles with his hammermen. The fifth lighthouse was assembled in a week because nomads from the salt marshes, who had appeared out of nowhere on their camels and stayed to live by the beacon. At the seventh beacon, the crew was caught in the edge of a minor storm, and for the first time in combat mode, the hub guided the front line with a thread, and the men stood under a clear sky in a corridor of roaring sand and wept. The ninth beacon was erected within sight of the northern lights, and at the 10th, an encounter took place. People approached the construction site of the 10th lighthouse from the north. 8 figures in old world suits, carrying gas cylinders, bore an emblem on their shoulders that Arden recognized from the keeper's platform, Helios's reconnaissance unit. The dome had been tracking the line of lighthouses all spring and had sent a group to meet them. The senior scout removed her helmet to reveal a woman in her 40s with the pale face of someone who had never seen the sun and eyes so full of incredulous happiness that it was painful to look at her. Her name was Engineer Assel. She had been born under the dome and had never stood under the open sky. Now she stood there, swaying in the wind, tears streaming down her face. Yet she laughed and said that the sky turned out to be so vast. That same night, via the Arden Beacon's radio, Arden spoke directly with Helios for the first time. The Dome Council expressed its gratitude and relayed the schedule of the great storms. The nearest clear window for the evacuation caravan would open in a month and last 8 days. The next one wouldn't come for another 3 months, by which time the dome might not even survive. So they had to leave during the first window. 941 people in a convoy, covering 600 kilometers in 8 days. And at the end of that conversation, Helios's radio operator relayed one last piece of information. 3 weeks ago, their long-range radar had detected a large movement of vehicles to the southeast. A convoy of over 70 vehicles was heading north, skirting Branch through the barren salt flats. Where it was headed was unknown. The radar lost track of it amid the interference. Arden stared at the map and felt the cold arithmetic falling into place. The director had remained silent all winter, not because he had resigned himself to the situation. He had been calculating, and he had come to the same conclusion as everyone else. Whoever controls the corridor at the moment of evacuation holds both the branch line and Helios by the throat. 70 vehicles were heading toward his corridor. The month leading up to the deadline was squeezed into a fist of preparations, and Arden slept only 4 hours a night. The branch was shifting to a wartime footing without a single order. Everyone simply understood what was at stake. This month's assembly work remains in my memory as a series of fragmented images. Here's Jurgen, with a combined brigade, building 3-wheeled tankers for the convoy at the base, using a captured fuel truck and 2 flat cars. Here is Kestra, who, after being wounded, became the head of all the branch's rifle training. With her left hand, she writes the shift schedule on the beacon's board, and now shoots from a rest better than before with both hands. Here is Dagvo, along with Ortiz's sons, fitting each beacon with barbed wire. Here is Una herding mobile teams down the corridor, practicing rope-assisted transfers between beacons. Here is Mara, with Wells's herbalists, preparing the infirmaries at every outpost for a flood of patients, and grumbling that she's never seen so many bandages at once in her entire life. Syra personally led the reconnaissance through the salt marshes and returned 10 days before the window, her face blacker than mud. She found the director's convoy. 76 vehicles were camped in a dead valley 2 days' march from the 7th beacon. Among the vehicles were 4 old-world armored tractors and equipment that reconnaissance couldn't identify. Long vehicles under tarps, with cables as thick as a hand. Selma recognized them from her sketches and cursed so loudly that the caravan drivers stopped to listen. Mobile emitters. The director hadn't bothered to rebuild the burned-out ridge. He'd mounted the infrasonic batteries on wheels. The plan was as clear as day. The director had no intention of storming the lighthouses. He intended to wait until the evacuation column had entered the corridor, then strike the beacon's signal chain midway with the emitters, sever the field, and unleash the very first storm into the breach. And then capture the survivors with his bare hands, just as one does after a shipwreck. The 900 people from Helios were not a target for him, but hostages for a future contract. The Corridor Council deliberated for a full day. Attacking the camp in the Hollow first would mean squandering the corridor's security forces right at the window, and the director was surely counting on that, using the camp as bait. Not attacking meant letting the caravan fall under the axe. Arden broke the deadlock by asking the overseer a question. He asked if the hub could intercept the mobile transmitters the same way it had intercepted the stationary ones. The overseer answered honestly, no. Mobile batteries operate in short pulses with frequency hopping. The hub would have 9 seconds to lock onto the frequency, but the pulse lasts only 4. The antenna is powerless against this technology. But the overseer added that it has its own flaw. The frequency hopping is controlled by a computer, and an old-world computer requires cold. The The vehicles under the tarps must have cooling systems, and in the desert, they consume water, a lot of water. The camp in the hollow is located where it is not for the sake of concealment. Reconnaissance confirmed this. In the hollow was the only deep well on the salt flats, belonging to an old geological camp. Water, the Achilles heel of any desert army. They put together a plan overnight, and it was devious, honest, and beautiful all at once. The branch won't harm a single one of the director's men. The branch won't poison the water. No. The very word poison stood like a wall. The branch will take the water. Jurgen and the drilling crew from the Crossroads well will take 4 days to reach, using Grandpa Ivo's old geological maps, the aquifer feeding the valley's well, and will drill an intercepting well higher up in the aquifer, pumping the aquifer into the new reservoir of the 8th lighthouse. The director's well will begin to run dry, slowly, naturally, just as wells do. Without water, the emitter calculators will overheat, the batteries will fail, and the 76 vehicles will face a choice: to head for distant water, a 3-day journey, or to push on toward the lighthouses where they are expected. And at that moment, Arden will offer the director a third option. The well was drilled in secret under the guise of reservoir construction, and Jurgen reached the lens in 5 days instead of 4, having gone gray during that 5th day. 3 days before the window opened, intelligence reported that there was commotion in the basin. The well was producing murky water. The consortium's tankers began shuttling back and forth to the distant Salt Lake, and the director lost what mattered most: freedom of maneuver. His convoy found itself tethered to the water tanker like a dog on a chain. The window opened at dawn on the appointed day. Helios released the caravan, and from the 10th beacon, it was spotted through the optics. The sight was biblical. 941 people, 120 dome vehicles, ranging from engineering all-terrain vehicles to open platforms carrying people in breathing masks. Assel drove the lead vehicle. The caravan entered the corridor, and the string of lighthouses lit up to welcome it. The first 3 days passed like a training exercise. The convoy proceeded on schedule, spending the nights at the beacons, and the hub twice deployed small advance units. During their overnight stops, the people in the domed vehicles touched the sand and hydroponic plants with their hands, and gazed at open fires as if they were miracles. The children of Helios, who had never seen the horizon, never strayed from the windows of their vehicles. And on the fourth day, when the caravan drew level with the 7th beacon right in the middle of the corridor, the director made his move. His column emerged from the depression, but did not head toward the beacons. It headed toward the 8th beacon's interception well. The director had calculated the source of his thirst over the course of 3 days, and decided to cut through the knot. Taking the well meant regaining the water supply and putting a knife to the throat of the corridor. 76 vehicles against the well's garrison of 20 men. Una, with her mobile units, could get there in 6 hours. The director's convoy in 5. And then Arden did what he had been planning in secret, even from the council. He drove out to meet the consortium's convoy, alone, on an Ortiz slow-moving tractor, just as he had once done with the Baron's convoy. Only now, the trailer wasn't carrying a fuel tank. Instead, the trailer carried a small beacon resonator connected by a cable to the thread. He stopped in the middle of the convoy's path in an open salt marsh, got out, and waited. The convoy reached him and came to a halt, because the director was anything but a fool. He wouldn't run over a lone figure without finding out why he was there. The director got out himself. He had aged over the past year. He was as thin as a rake. The two of them stood in the middle of the white salt flat between the army and the well, and Arden spoke. He said that the water would be returned to the director that very day. The well would stop pumping at his single word over the radio. The director raised an eyebrow. Arden continued. He said he knew how it would all end if the consortium went any further. The branch would lose people. The caravan might lose hundreds. But the director would also lose everything. Because this resonator on the trailer is currently activated and is holding the focus of the entire thread. And the thread is holding the hub. And the hub has been listening for 9 minutes to the consortium's batteries, which are standing right next to it in the convoy, warming up. 9 minutes is more than 9 seconds. The frequency map of the jumps has been scanned. The Keeper had been waiting for this showdown ever since that night in Caragaz. If the batteries fire, they'll fire at themselves. The director remained silent, staring at the resonator. Arden pulled not a weapon from his jacket, but the notebook of his grandfather, the Keeper Wells, and a folder. He placed them on the tractor's hood. The folder contained the protocols for the live reactivation of all 7 of the consortium's dead cores, the calculation of traffic flow on the southern roads, and a draft agreement in which the consortium would join the network as an equal node with its own council, its own operators, and a stake in the corridor. Everything that Arden had proposed twice, and that had been rejected twice. He said he was proposing it for the 3rd and final time, not because he was weak, because in 2 hours, platforms carrying children who had never seen the sky would pass them by, and he wanted the old man, who knew how to count better than anyone else in the South, to finally calculate what really mattered. How much is a network worth in which your grandchildren will be able to travel freely on any road on the continent? And how much is a desert worth in which you own everything and are left all alone? The wind swept a cloud of white salt across the salt flat. The director stared at the folder for a very long time. Then he said quietly that the emitters weren't being deployed for the thread. They were being deployed because, until that very moment, he hadn't believed that a living network was possible in the human world. He believed in discipline because he had seen the old world die from freedom. He picked up the folder from the hood with dry fingers and said that the consortium would leave the corridor before sunset. And in a week, his engineers would arrive in Caragaz to learn how to awaken the cores. And let Operator Arden know that if his network ever became what the consortium had become, he, the director, would be the first to remind him of this salt flat. The consortium's convoy turned around noon and headed south. Helios's caravan passed the 8th beacon by nightfall, unaware of how close the war had come. And on the 7th day of the window, when Caragaz was just a day's journey away, a string of beacons from the north brought news that made the blood run cold throughout the entire branch. Helios, drained but not dead, transmitted an automated report. An extraordinary, massive storm. Front 300 kilometers wide, originating in an anomalous zone. Vector, south. Expected to intersect the rear of the caravan in 20 hours. The 8-day window was closing a day early, and the rear of the caravan, with the slowest platforms carrying the infirmary and 200 children, would never make it to Caragaz in time. The 20-hour countdown began with cold, calculated precision on the hood of the lead vehicle. A cell laid out the travel schedule, and the numbers were unforgiving. The head of the caravan would reach Caragaz with time to spare. The middle section was cutting it close. The rear, consisting of 31 slow-moving flatbed trucks carrying the infirmary, the elderly, and the children, was 6 hours behind the safety zone. 6 hours with a major storm approaching? That wasn't just being late. It was a death sentence. The convoy council convened via radio on the move, and suggestions poured in, each more desperate than the last. Transfer the children to the faster vehicles. Acel did the math and shook her head. There were only enough fast vehicles for a third of the rear, and deciding who to take would have broken the caravan's morale even before the storm hit. Abandon the platforms and send the people on foot, traveling light. Mara replied that walking with the infirmary would mean certain death for the 30 bedridden patients. Hide the rear near the nearest lighthouse and wait it out. The keeper replied that a small lighthouse couldn't weather the great storm. The resonator of the 6th lighthouse would deflect the edge of the storm front, but the core of the great storm would crush its field in a matter of minutes. A small lighthouse against a great storm is like a candle against a river. And then Arden asked the keeper a question that had lain at the bottom of his memory for a whole year. He asked how the keeper's platform had carried its storm behind it for 40 years. It didn't deflect it, it carried it. So the field is capable not only of repelling the front, but also of guiding it. The keeper was silent for a long time. Then he said that Arden was asking about the forbidden mode, the storm's leash. His platform's generator had broken 40 years ago, precisely in that mode, and that was why it wouldn't shut down. Theoretically, the hub could, through the thread, not deflect the great storm, but instead harness it, catch the core of the front in resonance, and lead it. Change the vector of the entire storm by a few degrees. It wouldn't be much, but even a few degrees over a distance of 200 kilometers would shift the front by tens. If the front were shifted westward, the tail of the storm would slip past along its eastern edge. The stakes were terrifying. To steer the hub, a live node was needed, one extended toward the storm like a hand grasping a rope. Stationary beacons were useless. A mobile node was required, capable of entering the dead zone ahead of the front and maintain resonance while the hub pulled the vector. It would have to hold for about 3 hours, and the branch had exactly one mobile node. Jurgen's refueling truck at the fuel tanker base, which still housed a small portable core unit left over from the expedition for field node activation. The vehicle could enter, position itself, and become that hand. The only question was, who would drive the truck head-on into the great storm and sit in it for 3 hours on the path of a sky-high wall of sand, knowing that if the hub failed to maintain the resonance from the truck, they wouldn't even find the frame. Everyone volunteered. Jurgen said the truck was his, and the hand was his. Rin said he owed this branch his life. Yuna simply walked toward the cockpit in silence. Arden stopped everyone with a single word and said he would drive it himself. He said it wasn't a gesture, it was a calculation. The anchor node operator maintains direct communication with the hub via a key, bypassing radio delays. And on the lead, split-second decisions would be critical. Anyone else in the cockpit is an extra link between the hub and the storm. There was no arguing with that, and he could see from their faces how much they all hated it. Yuna said only that he'd promised her he'd return from Karagaz, and that debt wasn't settled. The two of them drove off into the night. At the last moment, Finn silently climbed into the cab and sat down so that the only way to pull him out would be to rip him out along with the seat. Arden looked at the deaf-mute guy who had guided him through the singing city and decided not to pull him out. Against the howling storm, Finn's deafness once again served as armor, and his hands remembered every nut the mechanic had tightened. Arden would remember the road toward the front forever. First, the stars in the north vanished. Then, a rumble came through the car's frame. Then, in the headlights, the first sand began to drift along the ground like smoke. 40 kilometers before the estimated point, the world ended and the front zone began. The sky, the earth, and the air became a single roaring gray mass. The refueler followed the thread that the hub held out before him with its last ounce of strength, like a corridor just wide enough for a single vehicle hull. They came to a stop at the designated point. Finn cut the engine, and in the vibrating darkness that followed, Arden placed both hands on the travel core and spoke to the system the word he'd been rehearsing the entire way. Activate the lead. What happened next defied description in human language, and Arden later told Yoon barely a tenth of it. The hub entered him through the key, and through the hub, the storm entered him. He felt the 300-kilometer-wide front as if it were his own skin. He felt the storm's core like a second heart, frenzied and ancient, and he sensed a third presence, the Keeper. The old machine from Caragaz took on all the mathematics of resonance, leaving to the human what it could not do itself, will. The storm was not alive, but it was stubborn, like all things immense. It did not want to turn. For 3 hours, Arden hung between the core and the sky, pulling. Not with strength. Human strength meant nothing there. He pulled just as his grandfather had once taught him in letters about jammed nuts. Don't strain, breathe, guide it. Finn sat beside him, holding him by the shoulders as his body arched and wiping the blood from under his nose. As the second hour drew to a close, the resonance began to waver, and the overseer said, right in the center of his mind, that the buffer was at its limit. And then something happened that no one had expected, and which was later recounted on the thread as a legend. A fourth voice gently entered the resonance. Then a fifth, then a sixth. Tilo raised the Wells node in support. Yuna raised the crossroads. The beacon operators, one after another, picked up the thread. And then came the seventh voice, heavy and unfamiliar. And the overseer said, with something resembling a laugh, that the consortium's first core, awakened that morning, had just entered the network for the first time. The director's engineers, who had studied in Karagazi, had activated it a day ahead of schedule upon hearing what was happening. The network pulled the storm through all its nodes, just as a team pulls a rope. And the storm shifted course by 4.5 degrees. By dawn, the front of the great storm had passed 22 kilometers west of the corridor, and the tail of the caravan crept along its eastern edge in the brown twilight under a sandstorm, yet fully protected by the thread. Platform 31, Infirmary, 217 children, not a single casualty. The refueler was found 6 hours after the front had passed, 2 kilometers from the estimated point, half buried. Finn dug the driver's door open from the inside before Yuna's search party arrived. Arden was alive. He was sleeping for the first time in a day, leaning against the cooled-down core, and didn't wake up. Not when they pulled him out, not when Mara cut off his shirt, stiff with sweat and blood, and not when Yuna cursed at him in his sleep with the last words of the root, her voice breaking. He woke up 20 hours later in the Karagaz infirmary because it was very noisy outside the window. He stood up, holding onto the wall, and walked over to the window. Down below in the square, by the pump tower, under the yellow pre-war streetlights, stood the entire Helios caravan. 941 people, every single one of them had made it. For the first time, the people of the dome had spent the night under the open sky as a whole city. Bonfires were burning. Someone was playing a stringed instrument from the old world. Helios's children slept haphazardly on platforms beneath stars they had never seen in their lives, while the adults sat around them and simply gazed upward. Engineer Acel stood by the Watcher's stationary platform, saying something to the old machine as she looked at its copper scars. And Arden knew somehow that she was saying thank you to those who had made it. The system chimed softly in the corner of his vision for the first time in a day. The message was short. Evacuation complete. 0 casualties. The network held. And below it hung a second line, which Arden reread many times before he could believe it. Incoming anchor synchronization request. Source, Helios node. Dome status, abandoned. Helios core status, transportable. The city was asking the branch for permission to bring its heart south. The Helios core was transported south in the fall by a large caravan, and the journey through the corridor of beacons took 12 days because they traveled slowly, just as one would transport a heart. The 40 metric ton capsule was pulled by 2 consortium tractor trailers under the protection of a combined convoy, where vehicles from the crossroads traveled side by side with the director's vehicles, a sight no one along the entire route would have believed a year ago. The question of where the core would be placed was decided by the network's Grand Council, which reached a unanimous decision faster than Arden had expected. Not in Caragaz, where the hub is, not at the crossroads, where it all began. The Helios core was placed at the network's center of gravity, at the intersection of the southern route and the northern corridor, in an open field where a year ago there was nothing but a milestone. The overseer explained a simple truth to the council. The heart of the network must not belong to any single city. Otherwise, that city will become the capital, and the capital will become the crown. And sooner or later, someone will want to claim that crown. The heart must belong to the road. The synchronization took place on the day of the autumnal equinox, and the entire network converged for it. Arden stood by the capsule, his hands on the key, and one by one he heard the voices enter the common circuit. The intersection in Yuna's voice, Wells in Tilo's voice, Caragaz in the overseer's voice, the 10 beacons of the corridor, 3 Factoria, the 2 awakened cores of the south, with the voices of the consortium's engineers, and the director himself was present in person, standing in the front row with his head uncovered. The Helios core accepted the network, and the network accepted the core. And at the moment the circuit was complete, something happened that was then witnessed by the entire wasteland within 100 kilometers. A wave of soft light radiated outward from the capsule in all directions, traveling along the wires to the nodes, and every terminal, every beacon, every column of the grid flashed for a second with an even, warm light. The system displayed the line Arden had been waiting 2 years to see. Anchor synchronization complete. Network status, autonomous, first-generation regional power grid, stability rating, self-sustaining, and below that, a line he hadn't expected. The anchor operator function is no longer critical. The network is capable of existing without a single control center. Arden read this and laughed amid the solemn silence, and his laughter was joyful. The machine had just politely informed him that he was no longer indispensable. He couldn't have imagined a better reward. The winter following synchronization became the first winter of the new world, and was etched in his memory as a montage of miracles that had become everyday life. Right there at the intersection near the core, a settlement is growing, one that the people themselves, without any guidance, named the core. And the first building erected there was neither a warehouse nor a wall, but a school for operators, where Tilo had recruited 20 students from across the entire network, including the director's 2 grandsons. Here, the former Baron Crow, having served his term as a laborer, is leaving, not for the East to join his sons, but to Wells, where he asks to be taken on as a mason. And after a long debate, the Wells Circle accepts him because Yvette says that walls don't ask a stone what it used to be. Assel, along with his dome engineers, is setting up resonator production in Caragaz, and the first caravans are carrying beacons east and west to lands the network knows only from old maps. Now Ren has become head of security for the entire corridor, and his former Garma gang members stand guard at the beacons as garrisons. And there is no service more honorable than theirs in the entire network. Now, on a winter evening, Selma and Jurgen call Arden to be a witness at their wedding in the Crossroads box, amid cars hoisted by lifts, and Mira cries and says that the old world knew how to build engines, but the new one has learned to build what really matters. In the spring, travelers arrived from the east. Ragged and with eyes full of distrust, they had walked for 3 months, guided by rumors of roads where fuel and water were sold to anyone at a fair price. They reported that beyond the salt flats to the east lay more cities and more hubs, sleeping and dead, and that people there were killing each other over fuel cans, just as they had been killed here 2 years ago. The Network Council listened to them all, and in the morning, Arden realized that the time had come for the final decision he'd been preparing all winter and had discussed only with Yuna and the overseer. He convened a grand council in the Corps and relinquished his status as anchor operator. He said that the network had grown, and the person at its heart was now a danger rather than a protection, because any heart belonging to a single person would one day stop beating or turn bitter. He proposed what he, Tilo, and Acel had been drafting all winter: the Network Charter. A council of operators from all nodes with equal voting rights, a network court that had grown out of the first Crossroads Court, and the rule of the elders, inscribed as the very first line: a node lives through the people who breathe within it, and belongs to them and no one else. The council debated for 3 days and adopted the charter on the 4th. The school nominated its best graduate as the anchor operator, and that turned out to be the 17-year-old daughter of the leather worker, the very same girl who had once watched the station's first battle from the store's basement. The circle closed so perfectly that Mara said that fate itself had drawn this blueprint with Grandfather Ivo's double arrows. And Arden himself, on the first day of summer, drove out of the Crossroads garage the car that he, Finn, and Yuna had been secretly assembling all spring like little boys. A long-range, all-terrain vehicle with a travel-ready core, a small resonator, and enough fuel for half a year's journey. He set off eastward as the network's first scout, toward a place where foreign nodes lay dormant, and people waited, unaware that the world had already turned. Yuna got into the passenger seat without asking a single question, because the question of where she would be had been decided a year ago on the salt marsh, when she realized that this man could never be allowed to go anywhere alone, ever. Finn loaded the tools and settled into the bed among the crates as if he were at home. The entire Crossroads and half the network came out to see them off. Dugwo placed a crate of forged tips for future lighthouses in the truck bed. Syra handed over her pre-war map of the eastern roads, marked with a lifetime's worth of notes. The director, who had arrived the day before on council business, silently shook Arden's hand and said he would be sending a trade caravan in a month's time because trade, not an army, should follow the scout, and that he had learned this from a young boy at a gas station. The caretaker was the last to speak with Arden over the radio from Karagaz, and the voice coming from the old radio was solemn and warm. He said that 40 years ago he had set out from Helios in search of a living node, but had found a living network, and that now, in his wake, the road was not overgrown, but beacons were blooming. He asked only that they send telemetry from the east, because old machines, like old people, need nothing more than to know that the road continues. Before getting behind the wheel, Arden climbed the Crossroads Tower one last time. Below lay his station, 4 living modules, a market beneath an airplane wing, a farm, a well, a bay where metal clanged. A line of caravans at the fuel pumps stretched beyond the horizon in both directions, and not a single person in that line had a hand on a weapon. The system quietly displayed the summary report before him, just as it had once displayed the first one. 23 nodes in the network, 4,208 permanent residents. Daily inflow to the network, 41,000 liters. He recalled the figure with which it all began, 3 liters per night from the breath of a single person in a deserted store. He went downstairs, got behind the wheel, and the all-terrain vehicle passed through the gates amid the roars and whistles of those seeing him off. Once past the gates, Yuna asked what he would tell the people in the east when they asked who he was and where he came from. Arden thought for a moment and replied that he would tell the truth. He would say he was a refueler. He was coming from the main road, where fuel was made from a simple thing that the old world had lost, but the new one had found. From people who slept under the same roof without fearing one another. The all-terrain vehicle pulled onto the eastern highway and picked up speed. Behind them, the crossroads faded into the haze, and above it, in the rising sun, the roofs of the grid glowed all the way to the horizontal. Ahead lay a wasteland, still wild, still yearning, but no longer hopeless, because caravans were making their way across it toward the all-terrain vehicle. Somewhere far to the north, the wind whipped sand over the empty dome of Helios, whose heart now beat at the crossroads of all roads. Somewhere to the south, engineers were awakening the third core, and the sands above the dead stations waited for their turn to sing. And in the bed of the vehicle, among the crates, slept a deaf-mute young man who had once the hearing people through the singing city. And he dreamed of how he later gestured toward a long road with lights every 60 kilometers. The story of Grandpa Ivo's gas station ended as it was meant to end, according to the blueprint with the double arrows. It ceased to be the story of a single station and became a road. And roads never end. Roads are passed on.